At 86, Andrew Parker Bowles has become the rare man whose silence explains more than a confession ever could. He did not divorce Camilla because of one dinner, one letter, one telephone call, or one royal thunderbolt from the ceiling of Buckingham Palace. That would be too neat, and this story was never neat. He divorced her because a marriage that had once suited everybody finally stopped protecting anybody. By the time the papers were signed in 1995, the romance had long since left the room, the gossip had taken a chair by the fire, and the whole country had begun behaving as if it owned the keys to their front door. The strange thing is that Andrew and Camilla never looked like enemies. That is what makes the story so unsettling, and in its own way so English. There were no broken plates in public, no theatrical courtroom speeches, no grand performance of wounded pride. Years later, after Camilla had become queen and Andrew had become the most intriguing former husband in Britain, they could still appear in the same room with the ease of people who had survived each other. He attended royal occasions. He supported family events. Their children, Tom and Laura, moved between them without the frost that often turns divorced parents into rival embassies. The public wanted a villain, preferably one with a hat. The people involved seemed to have chosen something more practical: manners. But manners can hide a battlefield. To understand why Andrew Parker Bowles let go of Camilla Shand, one has to go back before crowns, before recorded telephone calls, before Diana stood in front of a television camera and changed the weather inside the monarchy. One has to go back to a world where everyone knew everyone, and everyone pretended that knowing was not the same as telling. It was a small, polished world of country houses, London clubs, polo grounds, hunting weekends, regiment dinners, Catholic chapels, Anglican drawing rooms, and mothers who could arrange a future with the confidence of a general moving cavalry. Camilla was born into that world in 1947, not royal, but close enough to know which fork to use and when not to ask a direct question. She grew up with horses, dogs, fresh air, and a family that gave her the great gift of confidence without making her delicate. Her father, Major Bruce Shand, had been a decorated army officer and wine merchant. Her mother, Rosalind, came from the Cubitt family, which meant Camilla had respectable connections, comfortable expectations, and the sort of background that opened doors without her needing to rattle the handle. She was not raised to be dazzling in the fragile glass case sense. She was raised to be useful at dinner, cheerful in rain, steady on a horse, and unafraid of men who thought their opinions had been engraved on stone tablets. From early on, Camilla had a quality that does not sound glamorous until one sees how powerful it can be. She made people relax. Men liked her because she laughed at their jokes, and then, very often, improved them. Women liked her because she did not seem to be auditioning for sainthood. She was not chilly, not porcelain, not a girl built for a pedestal. She was warm, direct, country-bred, and socially fluent. In her set, that was its own currency. Andrew Parker Bowles was a different sort of currency altogether. Born in 1939, he belonged to an old Catholic family with military bones and aristocratic muscle. His father, Derek Parker Bowles, had served in the army and moved through the same social terrain where rank, land, regiment, and bloodline could still make a room turn its head. Andrew was educated at Benedictine schools and then entered the army, joining the cavalry world where Polish mattered almost as much as courage, and a good seat on a horse could take a man surprisingly far. He was handsome in the manner of a man who knew he was handsome, but had been trained not to appear to know it. He had height, charm, uniform, confidence, and that maddening ease some men possess when life has handed them the script early. He could walk into a party and make it feel as if he had been expected. He was also Catholic, which mattered more then than many people now remember. In the Britain of that time, faith was not only private belief. It shaped marriage prospects, family anxieties, and royal calculations. A Catholic officer might be welcome at the table, admired on the polo field, and invited to every decent party in the county. But when marriage came near the throne, the old rules tightened like a corset after pudding. Camilla met Andrew in the late 1960s, and from the beginning their relationship had the rhythm of a dance in which one partner occasionally left the floor to dance with someone else. He was exciting, unreliable, admired, and just difficult enough to become irresistible. She was lively, grounded, and loyal in the way that young women often are when they believe charm is a problem that marriage can solve. It rarely is, but Hope has never been famous for reading the small print. Their courtship was on and off, which is the polite phrase society uses when a man keeps returning without quite being captured. Andrew enjoyed women, and women enjoyed Andrew. That was not whispered as a shocking flaw in his world. It was treated almost as a weather condition, inconvenient for some, flattering for others, and generally expected to pass over the landscape without doing permanent damage. The double standard did not need to announce itself. It had a season ticket. Camilla, for all her confidence, was not immune to the old ache of wanting the man who would not settle. Andrew's attention could feel like victory, because it was never entirely guaranteed. That gave him power, though not always deliberately. He had the power of the charming man who does not quite make promises, and therefore can claim he has not broken them. In country houses and London parties, this made him fascinating. In marriage, it would become exhausting. Then Princess Anne entered the pattern. Anne was young, sharp, unsentimental, and horse-mad, which meant she and Andrew had plenty to talk about, and very little need for soft lighting. Their friendship, and whatever romance flickered around it, belonged to the same set of overlapping connections that made British high society feel like a village with better silver. Andrew was close to the royal family. He played polo. He moved easily near the young Prince Charles. He knew the language of stables, service, duty, and teasing. Anne, who had no patience for foolishness, seemed to enjoy his company. That alone said something. For Camilla it said rather more. The man she wanted was being linked with a princess, and not just any princess, but the daughter of the Queen. In another kind of story, Camilla might have retreated with dignity and found a safer man. In this one, she stayed in the orbit. That was either loyalty, stubbornness, or a remarkable failure to protect her own peace. Often in families with good china and bad communication, it is all three. Andrew's connection with Anne was never going to produce a royal wedding. His Catholic faith made that difficult in the old constitutional order, and Anne herself was not a woman easily herded toward anyone else's ideal ending. Still, the gossip had done its work. It showed Camilla something essential about Andrew. He could belong to her emotionally one season, and socially to someone else the next. He was not a man who made life simple. Unfortunately, simple men seldom dominate dinner party conversation. Around this time, Camilla crossed paths with Prince Charles, and the triangle that would later swallow half the monarchy began as something much smaller and more human. Two young people amusing each other. Charles, in the early 1970s, was not yet the grave, grey-haired king the world would later know. He was a young prince under immense pressure, sensitive, awkward at times, thoughtful, romantic, and surrounded by people who had opinions about his future before he had fully formed his own. He had position without freedom, privilege without ease, and a family machine that could turn affection into strategy by lunchtime. Camilla made him laugh. That was no small thing. In royal life, where everyone smiled but not everyone relaxed, laughter could feel like oxygen. She did not treat him as an exhibit. She teased him. She understood horses and country life. She knew his friends. She did not appear dazzled by his title, which naturally made her far more dangerous than someone who was. For Charles, Camilla offered warmth without ceremony. For Camilla, Charles offered attention without the old frustration of Andrew's disappearing act. But Charles was a prince, and princes in that era did not simply marry women because they were happy beside them. They married with the approval of family, church, palace, advisors, history, and the invisible committee of dead monarchs who always seemed to have the deciding vote. Camilla was not seen as the obvious future queen. She had a past, a personality, and a long attachment to Andrew Parker Bowles. In the marriage market around the heir to the throne, those were not assets. They were complications wrapped in a riding coat. Charles went away with the Royal Navy in 1973. Absence is often praised for making the heart grow fonder, but it also gives other people time to interfere. While he was gone, the old social machinery began to move. Camilla and Andrew's families were not blind. They had watched the long, messy courtship. They knew Andrew's habits. They knew Camilla's feelings. They also knew that an engagement could turn a drifting situation into a settled one, and in that world settlement was treated almost as a moral achievement. Happiness could be discussed later, preferably after the invitations had been posted. The engagement of Camilla Shand and Andrew Parker Bowles was announced in 1973. Some accounts suggest the announcement had the flavor of family pressure, as if the parents had grown tired of waiting for romance to become administratively useful. Whether the push came gently or firmly, the result was the same. Andrew proposed, Camilla accepted, and the great social sigh of relief could almost be heard from Wiltshire to Belgravia. Charles returned to find the woman who had made him laugh engaged to another man. It was not the first heartbreak in history, but because of who he was, it would not remain private forever. At the time, however, it looked like the proper ending. Camilla would marry the dashing officer she had loved for years. Charles would continue toward the destiny that had been waiting for him since birth. Andrew would become a husband, which many assumed would have a calming effect. This was optimistic, but optimism often attends weddings in a new dress. On July 4, 1973, Camilla Shand married Andrew Parker Bowles at the Guards Chapel in London. The date belonged to American independence, which was a tidy little joke history placed on the calendar without asking permission. There was Camilla, stepping into a marriage that looked like the perfect establishment match, while across the Atlantic people celebrated freedom from the British Crown. One could not make it up without being accused of trying too hard. The wedding was grand, crowded, and socially brilliant. Around 800 guests attended. There were royal faces in the pews, uniforms, hats, family pride, and the comfortable rustle of a class that knew how to turn a private decision into a public display of order. Camilla wore a white dress and a family tiara. Andrew wore the confidence of a man who had finally done what everyone expected, which is not always the same as becoming someone new. The reception took place at St. James's Palace, which gave the marriage the glow of royal approval without the burden of royal obligation. That was the peculiar position Andrew and Camilla occupied from the start. They were not royal, but they were close enough to be warmed by the lights and burned by them when the lamps turned harsh. Their friends included princes and princesses. Their social circle overlapped with the monarchy at every convenient and inconvenient angle. Privacy would always be conditional. At first, marriage seemed to suit them. They settled into country life, first at Bolhide Manor in Wiltshire, later at Middlewick House near Corsham. The names alone sound like places where Labradors sleep by the Aga, and someone is always misplacing a pair of muddy boots. This was the life Camilla understood: horses, children, dogs, friends for weekends, laughter in the kitchen, and the steady rhythm of rural society. She was not built for marble corridors. She was built for a house where people came in through the back door and no one fainted if a cushion had dog hair on it. Their son, Tom, was born in 1974. Their daughter, Laura, followed in 1978. Motherhood gave Camilla a center of gravity. She was affectionate, practical, and more interested in the daily life of her children than in polishing a public image. Tom and Laura were raised with the benefit and burden of names that opened doors and invited whispers. Their father's Catholic faith shaped parts of their upbringing, while Camilla remained Anglican. In another family, that might have caused a crisis. In their circles, it was simply one more arrangement to be managed with school choices, church services, and a great deal of not making a fuss. Andrew's army career continued. He rose through the ranks and would eventually become a brigadier. His professional life gave him structure, status, and purpose. It also kept alive the masculine world in which he was most admired: regiment, horses, discipline, camaraderie, and charm sharpened by competition. He was good at public ease. He could stand in a room and look as if nothing in life had ever seriously inconvenienced him. Men like that are often excellent company. They are not always restful husbands. Because the truth, even in the early years, was that Andrew did not become a different man simply because the wedding had been expensive. The roving eye remained. The appetite for admiration remained. The old habits remained, and old habits in a marriage are like damp in a country house. At first, everyone pretends it is just the weather. Then the wallpaper starts telling the truth. Camilla knew Andrew. She had not married a mystery. That is one reason the later public story, with its clean lines and easy blame, never quite fit. She was not an innocent child tricked into marriage with a stranger. She had loved a complicated man and married him anyway. Andrew was not a cartoon villain twirling a moustache between polo matches. He was charming, sociable, courageous in his profession, devoted in his own way to family continuity, and spectacularly ill-suited to the idea that marriage should mean emotional exclusivity. In their world, this was not unheard of. It was practically upholstered. For a while, Camilla's response was not rebellion but endurance. She made the household work. She raised the children. She remained socially central because she had the rare gift of making awkwardness less awkward. If Andrew flirted, people noticed. If Camilla noticed, she did not turn every occasion into a tribunal. That was considered admirable at the time. Today it may look more like a woman being trained to swallow discomfort with a smile. Both readings can be true. The more one looks at the marriage, the clearer it becomes that Andrew and Camilla were bonded by more than romance. They shared class, friends, habits, jokes, children, countryside, horses, and a deep understanding of the rules of their tribe. They knew how to behave at a memorial service, how to greet an ex-lover at a party, how to keep a seating plan from becoming a diplomatic incident. These skills sound small until one enters a world where social survival depends on them. They also knew how to avoid saying the one sentence that would force action. For many years that sentence was simple: "This is not working." Meanwhile, Charles did not vanish from the story. He married Lady Diana Spencer in 1981, in a ceremony watched by millions who believed they were seeing a fairy tale. Camilla attended that wedding as Mrs. Parker Bowles, wife, mother, countrywoman, old friend of the prince. To the public, she was barely a shadow at the edge of the picture. To those who knew the private history, her presence carried a more complicated weight. Diana was young, aristocratic, beautiful, and vulnerable in ways the institution did not fully understand. Charles was older, pressured, dutiful, and emotionally entangled with memories that had not been properly buried. The royal family hoped marriage would settle him. It did not. Marriage rarely cures a man of loving someone else. It simply gives the problem better stationery. Camilla, from her house in Wiltshire, remained part of Charles's trusted circle. At first, the connection could be described as friendship, and friendship was a useful word because it asked so little and concealed so much. Charles relied on her understanding. She knew his moods, his interests, his humor, his insecurity, and the strange loneliness of being surrounded by people paid to serve but not always able to comfort. Andrew, for his part, was not a man easily shocked by emotional arrangements. His own life had never been a sermon on restraint. This is where the public often wants a sharp turning point, a single door opening in the night. But marriages tend to decay more quietly than that. Andrew and Camilla's marriage did not collapse because Charles suddenly appeared. It had weak beams already. Charles mattered because he exposed what was weak. He gave Camilla a kind of emotional recognition that her marriage did not reliably provide. Andrew's affairs had taught her to live with divided loyalties. Charles gave divided loyalty a royal address. By the mid-1980s, the private strain around Charles and Diana was growing. The fairy tale had become a house with too many witnesses and not enough warmth. Charles and Camilla's intimacy resumed or deepened during these years, depending on which account one trusts and how much politeness one feels obliged to maintain. What matters for Andrew is that by then the Parker Bowles marriage had become less a conventional union than a durable arrangement. It had children, property, history, and habit. It did not have the kind of exclusive devotion that outsiders later pretended had been stolen in one dramatic raid. Andrew's pride must not be dismissed. A man can tolerate what he privately practices and still dislike being humiliated by it. That is one of the less charming miracles of human nature. For years, the old code protected him. Discretion mattered. So long as affairs remained inside the fog of their social world, the marriage could continue. People might know, but they did not say. They might say, but not in print. They might print, but not yet with the appetite that would arrive in the 1990s, when royal scandal became a national sport, and everyone suddenly considered themselves a marriage counselor. The old arrangement depended on silence, and silence was beginning to fail. Andrew Parker Bowles had grown up in a Britain where scandal could be managed by class, church, regiment, and the passage of time. Camilla had grown up in the same country, with the same training in cheerful concealment. Charles had been born into a palace that believed almost anything could be contained if handled with enough dignity and delay. Diana, painfully and brilliantly, would prove that the age of containment was ending. By the early 1990s, the private lives of Charles, Diana, Camilla, and Andrew had become public property. Books appeared, tapes emerged, newspapers circled, the careful old phrases, close friend, family friend, long-standing acquaintance, began to look absurd under the glare. The public did not want nuance. It wanted betrayal with names attached. Camilla became the woman in the story. Charles became the weak prince. Diana became the wounded princess. Andrew became the husband people forgot to study, though he may have understood the arrangement better than anyone. That is the first key to why he divorced Camilla. Not because he suddenly discovered heartbreak. Not because he had been living in a state of innocent astonishment. He divorced her because the private bargain had become a public spectacle, and spectacle destroys the usefulness of bargains. The marriage had survived affection without fidelity. It had survived gossip without exposure. It had survived emotional distance because the children were loved and the household still functioned. What it could not survive was becoming a national exhibit, with every old compromise dragged into daylight and judged by people who had never had to survive a country house weekend with a seating plan full of former lovers. Still, the final break did not come at once. That is important. Andrew did not storm out in 1992. Camilla did not instantly begin a new life. These were people trained to move slowly when movement could cause damage. Their son and daughter were not props in a royal drama. They were children, then young adults, forced to watch their mother's name become shorthand for scandal. Andrew, whatever his faults as a husband, remained their father. Camilla, whatever the public said, remained their mother. The divorce had to be more than an emotional decision. It had to be a family operation carried out under fire. In 1994, Charles gave his television interview to Jonathan Dimbleby and admitted adultery after his marriage to Diana had broken down. He did not name Camilla in the blunt way tabloids craved, but no one needed a map. The admission changed the temperature. What had been denied, implied, mocked, and whispered now entered official history. For Andrew, that interview was not merely another embarrassment. It confirmed that his marriage could no longer hide behind ambiguity. The world had been invited inside. There is a certain cruelty in being humiliated by facts one already knows. It is not the information that wounds, it is the audience. By then, Andrew and Camilla had reportedly been living largely separate lives for some time. That phrase, separate lives, is another polite expression that does heavy lifting. It can mean different bedrooms, different hearts, different calendars, different futures, or simply the same house with a colder silence. In their case, it meant the marriage had become formal before it became legal. The paperwork was late to the funeral. When divorce proceedings began, the stated grounds were that they had been living apart. This was the cleanest possible version of a very untidy truth. It avoided blame. It avoided courtroom theatre. It allowed both to preserve dignity, which in their world was not a decoration, but a survival tool. The divorce was granted in early 1995 and finalized that March. After 22 years of marriage, Andrew Parker Bowles and Camilla were no longer husband and wife. So why did he divorce the woman who would one day become queen? Because by 1995, the marriage no longer served the children. the households, the families, or the fiction. Because affection had survived where marriage had not. Because Andrew had his own life, and Camilla had long belonged emotionally elsewhere. Because the rules that once protected them had collapsed under a new, hungrier press. Because a husband can forgive privately what he refuses to perform publicly. Because sometimes divorce is not the explosion. It is the tidying up after the explosion everyone heard years earlier. And because Andrew Parker Bowles, for all his charm and all his sins, knew when a battle was no longer worth staging. The easiest mistake is to imagine Andrew Parker Bowles as a man pushed aside by royal history, standing helplessly while princes and princesses rearranged his life. He was not helpless. He was not especially naive. He was not, by most accounts, the sort of man who needed someone to explain what was happening over the breakfast table. Andrew had always known that society was not a straight road. It was a maze with excellent wine. People crossed paths, doubled back, forgave what suited them, condemned what embarrassed them, and called the whole thing tradition. He understood that maze because he had been raised inside it. He knew the difference between a private wound and a public scandal. One could be endured. The other required management. The Parker Bowles marriage belonged to that older world, where the outside appearance of a household could matter more than the private weather inside it. Not because everyone was heartless. That would be too easy. It mattered because families were networks, houses were statements, and reputation was a form of shelter. A person without reputation still had a name, but the name did not travel as smoothly through drawing rooms. Doors opened less quickly. Invitations grew oddly lost in the post. People began saying, "How is she?" with the soft tone usually reserved for dying pets. Camilla learned early how to survive that world without appearing to try. She was not a woman who entered a room like a chandelier. She entered like someone who knew where the dogs were, what the cook was called, and which guest needed rescuing from a colonel with a fishing story. That is an underestimated form of power. Beauty can silence a room. Ease can conquer it. As Mrs. Parker Bowles, she became one of those women country society relied on without formally appointing. She organized, soothed, laughed, visited, remembered names, and kept the rhythm going. In Wiltshire, the days had a pattern that looked simple from the outside, and was anything but. There were horses to arrange, children to raise, friends to host, charity events to support, and a husband whose charm did not always know when to come home. Camilla did not present herself as fragile. That made people assume she could bear anything. This is one of the more convenient mistakes people make about strong women. Andrew, meanwhile, moved through his own circles with the confidence of a man for whom the world remained broadly agreeable. The army suited him. It rewarded discipline, nerve, loyalty to the regiment, and a certain polished toughness. It also gave him a stage on which his natural qualities looked admirable rather than merely dangerous. In uniform, his charm appeared purposeful. On horseback, his courage had form. At dinners, his flirtation could be passed off as high spirits until it was not. He was not without feeling. That matters. The lazy version of the story makes him a careless husband and nothing more. But Andrew loved his children. He had affection for Camilla. He respected the social order that had shaped them both. He did not set out to destroy his own home. The trouble was that he wanted the comfort of a home without always accepting the discipline that keeps one intact. He enjoyed admiration the way some men enjoy a second drink. Harmless at first, then suddenly everyone else is doing the counting. Camilla's friends knew she had married a man with a wandering eye. She knew it too. This was not a secret waiting to be discovered under a pillow. Andrew's reputation had preceded him with all the subtlety of cavalry. In the years before their marriage, he had been linked to other women, including Princess Anne, and the story of that connection had followed Camilla into her engagement like a guest who had not been invited, but knew everyone anyway. And yet she married him. That decision was not foolish in the simple way outsiders might assume. Andrew was not only trouble. He was dashing, well-connected, brave, funny, and socially equal. He belonged to the world Camilla knew. He could give her a life of horses, children, houses, friends, and country seasons. He had history with her, and history can feel like destiny when one is young enough to mistake familiarity for proof. there was also pressure. Not the melodramatic kind with locked doors and cruel fathers. The subtler kind. The kind that comes from families who want things settled, friends who assume an outcome, and a society that treats a long courtship as a problem requiring paperwork. Camilla and Andrew had been circling each other for years. Engagement turned that circle into a line. Everyone could breathe again. No one asked too loudly whether the line led somewhere peaceful. Prince Charles, when he returned from naval service and found Camilla engaged, absorbed the blow with the outward discipline expected of him. He had been trained for disappointment in a way few people are. He could not simply choose. He could not sulk in public. He could not take romantic pain and turn it into a change of plan, because his plans belonged partly to the crown, partly to Parliament, partly to the church, partly to his family, and partly to a public that did not know him but had strong views about his bride. A prince may live in palaces, but everyone else seems to keep a spare key. Charles's early affection for Camilla became in time one of the central facts of 4 Lives. But in the mid-1970s, it was still possible to believe the matter had been folded away. Camilla was married, Charles was unmarried but moving through the expected social circuit. Andrew had won the contest, if it had been a contest. And if Camilla kept a corner of herself separate, well, many people did. Emotional bookkeeping in that set was rarely audited. The marriage began with all the props of stability. Bollerhyde Manor, where Andrew and Camilla lived in their early married years, was the kind of house that seemed to promise continuity. There were rooms made for guests, grounds made for horses, and the soft chaos of rural domestic life. Camilla fitted into it beautifully. She was not the sort to panic if a boot was left in the hall or a spaniel behaved as if it owned the sofa. She had been raised with animals and weather, which is a useful preparation for marriage to a cavalry officer. Tom's birth in 1974 brought joy and gave the household a new focus. He was named partly with Prince Charles as a godfather, a detail that would later acquire the weight of prophecy in the public imagination. At the time, it was simply proof of closeness within a circle where godparents were chosen as much for connection as devotion. A royal godfather was not unusual in those circles, though it did rather improve the christening conversation. Laura's birth in 1978 completed the family picture. A son, a daughter, a country house, a handsome officer father, a lively mother, friends in high places, and enough inherited social ease to make life look frictionless from a distance. But distance is kind. It removes the bills, the arguments, the closed bedroom doors, and the little humiliations that never appear in family photographs. Camilla's daily life was not glamorous in the way people later imagined. She was not waiting by a velvet telephone for a prince to call. She was raising children, running a household, managing social obligations, and living inside a marriage that required tolerance as a daily skill. Her humor became a shield, but not a cold one. She did not turn hard. She turned practical. That practicality may be the most important thing to understand about her. Camilla was capable of romance, but she was not built out of mist. She knew what things cost. Andrew's absences were not always physical. Sometimes the most painful absence in a marriage occurs when the person is perfectly visible at dinner. He could be there, charming the table, helping the evening sparkle, and still leave Camilla privately alone. His affairs, when they occurred, were part of the pattern. To modern ears, the social tolerance around them can sound astonishing. But among certain upper-class circles of that period, discretion, that code protected Andrew. It also trapped Camilla. If she complained too openly, she risked becoming the problem. If she endured, she was praised for, was the commandment. Fidelity was admired, certainly, but discretion was often treated as more urgent. Sin quietly if you must, but do not make the hostess change the seating plan. Good sense. Many women of her background understood this bargain. They had watched mothers, aunts, and friends navigate similar arrangements. The husband strayed, the wife kept the house, the children were protected, the guests were entertained. The marriage continued, because the alternative seemed messy, expensive, and socially tiresome. It is tempting to judge Camilla for accepting that bargain, But judgment is cheap when it arrives decades late and dressed in modern certainty. In her time and place, the choices were narrower than they looked. Divorce was possible, of course, but not casual. It carried a cost, especially for a mother with young children and a husband in a respected military career. Besides, Camilla was not miserable every day. That is another difficulty with real marriages. They do not fail in a single color. There were good days. There was laughter. There were friends. There were shared jokes and family routines. Andrew could be generous. Camilla could be fond. A person can be hurt by a marriage and still be attached to it. Human beings are inconvenient like that. Through the late 1970s, Charles remained part of their wider world. He was still searching for a wife, and the search became increasingly public. Every suitable young woman seemed to be measured, photographed, and placed under the national microscope. The future queen needed to be aristocratic enough, charming enough, young enough, Protestant enough, and untouched enough by scandal to satisfy a country that liked romance but preferred paperwork. It was a remarkably specific job description for a woman expected to smile as if none of it were demeaning. Camilla was not a candidate. That decision had been made before most of the public knew there had been a question. She had married another man. She had a history. She was not the innocent figure the royal machine believed it needed. Yet Charles trusted her more than many who were officially suitable. That created a problem no palace official could solve, because it was not technical. It was emotional. When Charles married Diana in 1981, the country was ready to believe. The ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral had scale, youth, pageantry, and a bride who looked as if she had stepped from a storybook into a state occasion. Diana was only 20. She carried the hopes of millions, which is a heavy load for anyone, let alone a young woman entering a family where even breakfast could have constitutional undertones. Andrew and Camilla were among the wider royal circle watching the marriage begin. For Andrew, Charles's wedding might have seemed to close an old chapter. For Camilla, it must have been more complicated. She had once been close to the groom. She had married elsewhere. She now watched him marry a young woman who did not yet know the full emotional geography of the life she was entering. The ceremony looked like an ending. It was not. It was the beginning of a much larger tragedy, with better hats. Diana soon sensed that Camilla mattered. She was not stupid. She was young, insecure in that environment, and often isolated, but she had emotional intelligence sharpened by pain. She noticed what others hoped she would miss. She noticed gifts, glances, references, little private signals that told her there was a language being spoken around her that she did not fully understand. Nothing makes a person feel lonelier than realizing two people in the room share a past that has more authority than your present. For Camilla, Diana's presence transformed an old attachment into something far more dangerous. Charles was no longer an unmarried prince leaning on an old friend. He was a husband, and soon a father. The moral stakes changed. The social stakes changed. The risk to Camilla's own marriage changed. Andrew could tolerate ambiguity in the familiar old style, but royal marriage was not ordinary ambiguity. It had photographers at the gate. Still, the habits of the old world held for a while. People visited, friends overlapped. Charles remained close to the Parker Bowles household. Camilla remained part of the country life he loved. Andrew continued in his own pattern. The circle absorbed the strain because that is what such circles do until they cannot. They had a gift for keeping the conversation moving even when the room was full of emotional furniture everyone was politely bruising their shins on. Andrew's position in those years is often misunderstood. He was not outside the drama. He was inside it, but not always in the way the public later imagined. He knew Charles. He knew Diana. He knew Camilla better than anyone. He also knew himself. If his marriage was not conventionally faithful, he could hardly pose as a shocked moralist without inviting laughter from people who had known him since dinner jackets were still being worn without irony. That did not mean he felt nothing. It meant his reaction had layers. There may have been irritation, wounded pride, resignation, and even a kind of gentlemanly calculation. If he made a public fuss, He would damage Camilla, embarrass the prince, distress the children, and invite scrutiny of his own conduct. If he stayed quiet, he preserved the family structure and protected his own dignity. Silence was not weakness. In his world, silence was often the most aggressive form of self-control. The children, Tom and Laura, grew up in the shadow of this complicated adult arrangement. At home, their mother was not a national villain. She was Mum. She packed, fussed, laughed, nagged, loved, and did the ordinary things that children remember long after history has finished shouting. Their father was not a footnote. He was Dad, military, charming, sometimes absent, but part of their identity. The later public drama would ask them to accept a version of their parents that was both too simple and too cruel. Children of scandal often become experts in two realities: the family they know and the family everyone else discusses. By the mid-1980s, Charles and Diana's marriage was visibly strained to insiders, though the public image still tried to hold. 2 sons had been born, William in 1982 and Harry in 1984. The royal family had its heirs. The line was secure. On paper, the marriage had fulfilled its historic function. But paper has a poor record of keeping people warm. Charles felt misunderstood and emotionally starved. Diana felt abandoned and humiliated. Both were trapped, and both reacted in ways that deepened the trap. Their temperaments were badly matched. He retreated into old comforts, work, friends, books, causes, and Camilla. Diana reached for affection, validation, and finally the public itself, which offered sympathy at a price. The monarchy had expected her to adjust. Instead, she learned to communicate with a nation that already loved her. That changed everything. For Andrew and Camilla, the danger increased with every crack in the Wales marriage. Camilla could not remain merely an old friend if Charles's dependence on her became the emotional centre of his life. Andrew could not remain merely the tolerant husband if the tolerance became visible to outsiders. A private arrangement can be sophisticated. A public arrangement looks ridiculous. That is the fatal difference. Yet in those years, Andrew still had reasons to hold the line. Divorce would have made Camilla more exposed, not less. It would have suggested that the rumours were true, and truth was not yet something anyone wished to encourage. It would have disrupted the children. It would have drawn attention to property, money, and family arrangements. It would also have ended a partnership that, for all its failures, still contained affection and utility. Marriage, especially in old social circles, was not only a romantic contract. It was an alliance, a household, a reputation, and a child-raising enterprise with occasional shooting weekends attached. Camilla also had reasons not to leave. Charles could not offer her a normal future. He was still married to Diana. He was heir to the throne. Any open relationship with him would ignite scandal beyond anything she had known. Remaining Mrs. Parker Bowles gave her cover, identity, and a place in the world. It allowed everyone to pretend, and pretending was still considered preferable to collapse. The great irony is that Andrew's own behaviour may have made the arrangement easier to sustain. A more possessive husband might have forced a crisis earlier. A more innocent husband might have been destroyed by the humiliation. Andrew was neither. He was worldly. He had his own attachments. He understood that adult life in their circle was often less tidy than the prayer book implied. His tolerance was not saintly, it was practical, and perhaps tinged with guilt. A man who has wandered is less eager to install floodlights. This did not make the marriage painless, it made it survivable. Camilla's reputation inside her circle remained largely intact through much of the 1980s. She was liked. That mattered. People who knew her did not see the cold, scheming figure later created by the tabloids. They saw a woman who was funny, loyal to friends, fond of her children, and capable of making a room feel less tense. Her flaws were real, but they were human scale. She had fallen into, or chosen, a relationship that helped damage another marriage. That cannot be brushed aside. But she was not a villainess from a cheap novel. She did not live in a tower stirring royal marriages in a pot. Mostly she lived in the country, wore practical shoes, and tried to keep going. Diana, however, experienced Camilla not as a countrywoman with a laugh, but as the third presence in her marriage. That was the truth Diana had to live with. It is possible to understand Camilla and still see why Diana suffered. It is possible to see Diana's pain and still understand why Charles clung to the person who made him feel known. The tragedy is not that one person was good and another was bad. The tragedy is that everyone had a case, and none of the cases could peacefully coexist. Andrew's case was the least publicly understood. He had married Camilla after years of pursuit and delay. He had not always honored the marriage. He had allowed, or at least endured, a connection between his wife and the Prince of Wales. He had reasons of pride to object, reasons of guilt to remain quiet, and reasons of family to avoid a rupture. He was not simply betrayed. He was part of the emotional economy that made betrayal harder to define. By the end of the 1980s, the old protections were weakening. Britain's press had become more aggressive. Royal reporting had shifted from deferential coverage to pursuit. Photographers waited outside homes. Telephone calls were hunted. Former friends could become sources. Staff could become witnesses. A marriage no longer needed to fail privately. It could be serialized. The royal family, which had survived wars, abdication, and constitutional storms, found itself strangely vulnerable to intimacy. It knew how to handle protocol. It did not know how to handle emotional exposure. No palace official could issue a statement elegant enough to make a lonely wife feel loved. No private secretary could turn a long-standing affair into a manageable diary conflict. Human pain was leaking through the walls, and the wallpaper was expensive. In 1989, according to Diana's later account, she confronted Camilla at a party. The setting was socially perfect for disaster: friends, familiar rooms, polite voices, and beneath them the pressure of years. Diana told Camilla that she knew what was going on. The confrontation did not resolve anything, but it revealed the new order. The injured wife was no longer willing to remain silent. Camilla, accustomed to discretion, was facing a woman who had learned that silence only protected other people. For Andrew, moments like that signaled danger. The problem was no longer contained among people who shared the same rules. Diana did not accept the old rules. Why should she have? They had served everyone except her. Her refusal to play quietly turned a private aristocratic arrangement into a moral confrontation. The old world found this alarming. The public would eventually find it riveting. Still, Andrew and Camilla remained married. That fact is the strongest evidence that divorce was not simply about adultery. If adultery alone had been enough, the marriage would have ended years earlier. It endured because the people inside it had built a structure around the damage. The structure was cracked, but it stood. What finally brought it down was publicity, pressure, and the collapse of usefulness. The early 1990s arrived like a storm moving from the horizon to the front door. Charles and Diana's marriage began to fail in public. The carefully managed photographs of family life could not hide the chill. Diana's unhappiness found channels. Friends spoke, journalists listened. The book that presented her side of the story changed the royal landscape. Suddenly the public was not merely watching a fairy tale fade. It was being invited backstage, where the scenery was splintered and the actors were bleeding. Camilla's name moved from whisper to accusation. The woman who had once been almost invisible became unavoidable. She was blamed for Diana's misery, Charles's weakness, and the monarchy's hypocrisy. Some of that anger came from genuine sympathy for Diana. Some came from the public's need to place complex grief into a single container. Camilla became that container, and it was filled to the brim. Andrew watched as his wife was transformed into a national symbol. Not a person, a symbol. That is a brutal thing to happen to anyone, even someone who has made serious mistakes. Symbols cannot explain themselves. They cannot be tired, funny, kind to a child, loyal to a friend, or frightened in the kitchen. They are flattened for public use. Camilla was flattened into the other woman, and once a woman has been given that title, nuance is asked to leave by the tradesman's entrance. The humiliation for Andrew was different. He was not hated in the same way. He was almost treated as scenery, the husband whose existence made the scandal more piquant, but whose feelings were rarely examined. Yet that kind of erasure has its own sting. He had been a husband for nearly 2 decades. He had children with Camilla. He had shared houses, friends, losses, routines, and family duties. Now the world spoke of his marriage as if it were merely an obstacle in a royal love story or a technical inconvenience in Diana's tragedy. A proud man does not always shout when pride is wounded. Sometimes he becomes cooler, tidier, more formal. Andrew's response remained controlled. He did not grant theatrical interviews. He did not try to compete with the prince. He did not parade himself as a victim. Whether from discipline, calculation, affection, or all three, he kept to the code he knew best: say little, behave well, and let other people exhaust themselves. But silence by then could not save the marriage. It could only shape the ending. The divorce that came in 1995 was therefore not an impulsive act. It was the delayed recognition of a truth that had been building for years. Andrew did not need Camilla to confess what everyone already suspected. He did not need Charles to admit what insiders had long understood. He did not need newspapers to instruct him in his own domestic life. What changed was the balance of cost. Staying married had once protected the children, the household, and everyone's dignity. By the mid-1990s, staying married protected almost nothing. It merely kept Andrew tied to a scandal that had outgrown the drawing room and moved into every newspaper kiosk in Britain. There is an old phrase people use when they want to make an emotional defeat sound civilized. They grew apart. In Andrew and Camilla's case, they had not only grown apart. They had grown around other attachments, other obligations, and other versions of themselves. Their marriage had become a frame holding a picture that no longer matched the room. And yet the ending was not hatred. That may be the most revealing detail of all. After the divorce, Andrew and Camilla did not behave like enemies finally released from prison. They behaved like members of a family that had changed shape. He remarried. She continued slowly and painfully toward a future with Charles that no one could yet imagine ending in a coronation. Their children remained the quiet center of what had to be protected. The social world that had watched everything unfold absorbed the new arrangement with its usual mixture of gossip and good linen. To the public, the question remained deliciously simple. Why did Andrew divorce Camilla? But the real answer resisted simplicity. He divorced her because the marriage had become impossible to defend, not because affection had vanished overnight. He divorced her because the old rules had failed, not because he had only just discovered they had been broken. He divorced her because everyone in the story had moved into a new era, and his marriage was one of the last pieces of old furniture left standing in a room already on fire. What Andrew knew, perhaps better than anyone, was that Camilla was not leaving him for a fantasy. She was walking into a storm. Charles could offer love, but not peace. Diana could command the sympathy of the world, and often deserved it. The press could keep the scandal alive long after the people involved were exhausted. The monarchy could not simply welcome Camilla without appearing to insult the princess the public adored. If Andrew wanted revenge, all he had to do was step back and let history proceed. It would be punishment enough. But Andrew did not appear to want revenge. That is where his character becomes more interesting than the headline. He had every opportunity to make himself central, and he refused. He could have sold pain, sharpened embarrassment, and cast himself as the wronged husband. There would have been an eager market. A great many people have built smaller grievances into larger incomes. Andrew chose instead the old discipline of restraint. Restraint is not innocence. It is not nobility by itself. Sometimes it is habit. Sometimes it is pride. Sometimes it is the last luxury of people trained never to explain themselves to strangers. But in this case, restraint did something useful. It prevented an already wounded family from becoming a circus with assigned seating. That was Andrew Parker Bowles's peculiar gift to the story. He did not make the scandal. He did not stop it. He did not cleanse it. He simply refused to feed it more than necessary. In a drama crowded with emotional exposure, his silence became almost louder than speech. And inside that silence was the real revelation. The divorce was not the end of love. It was the end of pretending that love, marriage, duty, pride, and public reputation could all keep sharing the same address without someone eventually changing the locks. The locks did not change all at once. They clicked one by one in the dark. In the early 1990s, the private world that had protected Andrew and Camilla began to lose its authority. It was not that people suddenly became immoral or suddenly became moral, which would have been even more surprising. It was that the old agreement between the upper classes and the press broke down. For decades, a great deal had been known and not printed. Affairs were hinted at. Drunken evenings were softened into anecdotes. Cruelties were folded into phrases like, "They have had their difficulties." Then the appetite changed. The public wanted the locked room opened, and the newspapers discovered that royal unhappiness sold better than royal ribbon cutting. Andrew Parker Bowles belonged to the world before that change. He had been trained by family, regiment, and class to believe that certain things were handled privately or not at all. One did not rush into print with one's humiliation. One did not hold press conferences about the bedroom. One did not explain the emotional failures of one's wife, one's prince, or oneself to strangers eating toast over a tabloid. It was not only a code, it was a kind of armor. The trouble with armor is that it is heavy, and it does not stop people from pointing. By 1992, the royal marriage of Charles and Diana had become impossible to disguise. Andrew Morton's book appeared that year, and it changed the public story. It presented Diana as isolated, wounded, and betrayed. It spoke of unhappiness behind palace walls with a directness that shocked those who still believed royalty should only suffer in approved fonts. The book did not merely report a marriage in distress. It gave the distress a heroine, and once the public had a heroine, it began searching for the opposite. Camilla was waiting in the wings, though she had never applied for the role. The image that formed around her was brutally simple. Diana was young, beautiful, emotional, and publicly lonely. Camilla was older, married, familiar to Charles, and private. That was enough for a national melodrama. Never mind that Camilla had children who were watching. Never mind that Andrew existed. Never mind that Charles and Diana had their own failures, mismatches, resentments, and injuries. Complexity is poor fuel for outrage. It burns too slowly. Andrew's marriage now became a public clue in someone else's mystery. Reporters did not need to understand the Parker Bowles household in order to use it. They needed only the outline. Camilla was married to Andrew. Camilla was close to Charles. Diana was unhappy. Therefore, Andrew must be either blind, weak, humiliated, complicit, or impossibly civilized. The public likes 5 choices, provided none require much sympathy. But Andrew was harder to place. He would not perform outrage. He would not collapse. He would not turn his private life into a courtroom. This made him unsatisfying as a character for people who wanted clear, emotional furniture. He behaved as if his life belonged to him, which in a media storm can look almost rude. Inside the storm, however, there were real human consequences. Tom and Laura were no longer simply the children of a well-connected country couple. They were the children of the woman accused of destroying the people's princess. School corridors, parties, newspapers on kitchen tables, careless whispers in shops, all of it would have reached them in some form. Children of public scandal do not need every adult to be cruel. They only need enough adults to forget they are children. Camilla had spent years relying on private resilience. She had taken Andrew's infidelities, Charles's dependence, social gossip and domestic tension, and somehow remained functional. That did not mean she was made of iron. The press turned her into a shape that could be attacked daily without anyone feeling too guilty. Her clothes were mocked. Her looks were mocked. Her age was mocked. Her voice, her hair, her habits, her friendships all became material. The old world had many faults, but it knew the value of not saying everything. The new world said everything, then asked for a second edition. Andrew saw this. Whatever pain lay between them, Camilla was still the mother of his children and a woman he had known since youth. Their marriage had become strained, perhaps even hollow in places, but it was not nothing. A long marriage is never nothing. It contains birthdays, illnesses, rooms decorated together, horses bought and sold, children's first steps, private jokes, dinners that went wrong, mornings that went right, and arguments so old they become part of the wallpaper. Even when love changes shape, history remains in the house. That is why Andrew's silence cannot be dismissed as indifference. It may have been pride. It may have been discipline. It may have been emotional caution. It may also have been a final form of protection. He could not save the marriage, but he could refuse to make its ending more savage. The public image of Andrew as merely the wronged husband missed another uncomfortable fact. His own life had never been arranged around spotless fidelity. He had long been known as a man admired by women and attentive to them in return. In his set, this did not make him an outcast. It made him familiar. Some men were bores, some were gamblers, some were drinkers, and some were charmers with a flexible view of vows. Society absorbed them all, then placed them carefully at dinner. Camilla had lived with that reality. Her own later relationship with Charles did not arise in a marriage untouched by betrayal. That does not excuse it, but it explains the emotional climate. She had learned from Andrew, and perhaps from the world around them, that marriage could contain compartments. One compartment for the public couple, one for the children, one for the house, one for desire, one for loyalty of a kind, one for whatever could not be admitted without causing structural damage. The problem was that Charles was not just another man in another compartment. He was the Prince of Wales. His emotional life came with national consequences. An affair inside a country set could be managed by discretion. An affair involving the future king threatened the monarchy's self-image, Diana's dignity, Camilla's safety, Andrew's pride, and the trust of a public that had been sold a wedding as a fairy tale and now wanted a refund. Then came the recordings. The private telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla, recorded in 1989 and published in the press in 1993, became one of the most damaging moments of the entire saga. The details were intimate, embarrassing, and humiliating. It was the kind of exposure that no human being can dress up with good posture. The public laughed, gasped, judged, and repeated lines that were never meant to leave a private call. For Charles, it was a disaster. For Camilla, it was a social and personal assault. For Andrew, it was the point at which private knowledge became public humiliation in its purest form. There is a difference between knowing your marriage has failed and hearing the world snicker over the evidence. Andrew had known enough. He was not newly informed. But the tape removed the last protective veil. It forced him into a role he had not chosen. The husband whose wife's intimacy with the heir to the throne had become breakfast entertainment. A lesser man, or merely a noisier one, might have struck back. Andrew did not. No grand interview, no theatrical condemnation, no parade of wounded masculinity. He gave the country almost nothing. It was a refusal that must have frustrated editors because wounded husbands are useful. They provide quotes, tears, and righteous anger. Andrew provided posture, absence, and the maddening suggestion that not every injury is for sale. Yet his quietness should not be mistaken for serenity. Pride matters in this story because Andrew was a proud man from a proud tradition. The army had shaped him. Catholic discipline had shaped him. Family history had shaped him. He knew how to stand still under pressure, but standing still is not the same as feeling nothing. The tape made his domestic humiliation public, and public humiliation has a special cruelty. It does not ask whether the injured person is innocent enough to deserve compassion. It simply exposes him and lets strangers decide how much he should hurt. Camilla retreated. Her social life narrowed. Friends remained loyal, but loyalty had to work harder now. Being invited somewhere was no longer just hospitality. It was a statement. Some people stood by her quietly. Others stepped back with the neat cowardice of people who call it discretion. She was not yet the royal consort she would one day become. She was not protected by palace walls. She was a private woman under public attack, and the attacks were relentless enough to make even a strong woman count the windows before entering a room. Andrew's response was to keep the family functioning as best as possible. That sounds dull, but in scandals, dullness can be mercy. The children needed parents who did not turn every newspaper into a weapon. They needed not to feel that loving one parent required betraying the other. Andrew and Camilla, for all their failures as a couple, seemed to have understood that. They did not force Tom and Laura into an emotional battlefield, at least not publicly. In a story crowded with adults who struggled to protect the young from pain, that restraint deserves notice. Meanwhile, the royal family was doing what it often did under pressure, moving slowly and hoping time would develop better manners. But time had become unruly. In December 1992, Charles and Diana formally separated. The announcement came after years of strain, and it confirmed what had become obvious. The future king and the beloved princess were no longer able to live as husband and wife. The monarchy could still present the separation as dignified. The public understood it as disaster with letterhead. Once Charles and Diana separated, Camilla's position changed again. She was no longer only rumoured to be involved with a married prince whose marriage was publicly intact. She was now linked to a separated prince whose future remained uncertain. This did not make her accepted, it made her more visible. Diana's supporters saw her as the cause of the wreckage. Charles's supporters saw her as the woman he had always loved. Most people preferred a simpler version, a triangle, a betrayal, a princess in pain, and an older woman who had refused to disappear. But Camilla could not disappear, not completely. She had children, friends, charities, a house and a life. She also had Charles, who still depended on her. The more the world condemned their bond, the more emotionally central it seemed to become. Forbidden love can be romantic in novels. In real life it creates logistics, lawyers, security worries, and a great deal of awkward tea. Andrew understood logistics. His marriage had become one. By this stage, he and Camilla were living largely apart. The relationship had settled into a form that allowed them to remain connected as parents and social companions, while no longer pretending to be a conventional couple. Many marriages die before they are buried. The Parker-Bowles marriage had reached that condition, respected in outline, empty in the middle, still standing because no one had yet agreed where to place the coffin. The reason it lasted as long as it did was not confusion. It was calculation, and not the cold, villainous kind. It was the calculation adults make when there are children, houses, reputations, and long histories involved. What would divorce solve? What would it expose? Would it help Tom and Laura? Would it protect Camilla or leave her more vulnerable? Would it make Andrew look dignified or merely discarded? Would it give newspapers a clean new chapter to devour? For a time, staying married seemed less destructive than ending it. Then the balance shifted. Charles's 1994 television interview with Jonathan Dimbleby was one of the moments that shifted it. In that interview, Charles admitted he had been unfaithful after his marriage had broken down beyond repair. It was a carefully phrased admission, the sort of royal sentence that tries to walk through a minefield wearing polished shoes. But the meaning was obvious. Camilla was not named in the crucial answer, but she did not need to be. The country filled in the blank with enthusiasm. For Diana, the interview confirmed what she had long felt. For Charles, it was an attempt to explain himself as a serious man trapped in an unhappy marriage, not merely a weak husband caught in scandal. For Camilla, it intensified the glare. For Andrew, it made the final pretense almost impossible. The heir to the throne had publicly acknowledged the conduct around which so much of Andrew's married life had been silently arranged. The old fiction could not be restored. Someone had opened the curtains and removed the curtain rail for good measure. There is something especially hard about being the person who is expected to remain dignified while others confess. Andrew did not have the luxury of telling his version in full, or perhaps he had the luxury and chose not to use it. Either way, his silence left people guessing. Did he feel betrayed? Certainly in some measure. Did he feel guilty? Possibly, given his own past. Did he still care for Camilla? The evidence suggests he did, though not as a husband in the old sense. Did he want freedom? Almost certainly. By the mid-1990s, freedom may have looked less like a romantic adventure and more like a clean room with no reporters at the curtains. In January 1995, Andrew and Camilla announced their divorce. The language was careful, as expected. They had lived apart for some time. Their marriage had broken down. There was no dramatic blame, no public savaging, no display of bitterness. It was the legal version of a door being closed quietly by people who knew the house was already full of smoke. The timing mattered. Charles had admitted adultery the previous year. Diana's side of the story was already powerful in the public mind. The telephone tape had done its damage. The Wales marriage remained legally intact but spiritually shattered. For Andrew and Camilla, waiting longer would have achieved little. Their own marriage could no longer offer cover. Instead, it made everyone look more trapped. Divorce, once dangerous, had become practical. The divorce was finalized in March 1995. 22 years after the Guards' Chapel wedding, the match that had once seemed to settle a young woman's uncertain romantic future came to an end. It had produced 2 children, many friendships, and a bond that did not vanish with the court order. It had also produced years of compromise, pain, and public humiliation. A marriage can be both meaningful and failed. That is one of the truths people dislike because it denies them the pleasure of a clean verdict. The financial details were not the grand aristocratic war some might imagine. There was property, of course, and the practical division of lives built over decades. But this was not a battle over a throne, a duchy, or some glittering fortune with footmen guarding the spoons. The real inheritance at stake was less visible. The children's peace, the family's dignity, and Camilla's ability to survive the next chapter without being fully crushed by the last one. Andrew emerged from the divorce with an unusual public position. He was the former husband of the most criticized woman in Britain, and yet he had not become her enemy. He was connected to the royal family, but not absorbed by it. He was wounded by the scandal, but not defined by complaint. His restraint made him look either noble, chilly, practical, or all three, depending on the observer's appetite. It also preserved his social standing. In his world, a man who did not lose his head was often assumed to have kept his honor, even if the rest of the story was more complicated. Camilla, newly divorced, was technically freer and socially more exposed. Marriage to Andrew had been a shield, even a cracked one. Without it, she was more clearly seen as Charles's partner, though no official future was promised. She had lost the protection of being Mrs. Parker Bowles in the conventional sense, but she had not gained the protection of being publicly accepted by the prince's world. She stood in the open, and the weather was vile. This is where Andrew's decision becomes sharper. By divorcing Camilla, he did not punish her in the obvious way. He released them both from a fiction that had become harmful. He also allowed the true shape of the situation to appear. That act carried risk. It made Camilla's connection to Charles more naked. It made Andrew's humiliation official. It invited another round of headlines. But it also ended the daily absurdity of pretending that a marriage hollowed out by time, affairs, and scandal was still the proper container for everyone's lives. A person can hold a door open out of kindness, exhaustion, pride, or simply because the room is on fire. Andrew may have had all 4 reasons. The public, however, was not finished. In 1995, Diana gave her own television interview to Martin Bashir, and with one sentence about there being 3 people in her marriage, she placed Camilla permanently in the national imagination. The line was devastating because it was simple, memorable, and emotionally true from Diana's point of view. It reduced years of private misery into a phrase that could fit in every headline. Camilla's name became almost unnecessary. Everyone knew who the third person was. Andrew, by then, was legally out of the marriage, but not out of the story. A divorce decree cannot erase years of connection. He remained tied to Camilla through Tom and Laura, through old friends, through shared history, and through the social reality that no one in their circle ever truly disappears. In aristocratic Britain, divorce changes the seating plan. It does not always change the guest list. That fact would become important later. Andrew did not exile Camilla. He did not demand that friends choose. He did not use the children as weapons. He did not prevent the continuation of family life in altered form. Such restraint may sound ordinary until one considers the circumstances. Most divorces do not unfold beneath the shadow of a future king, a beloved princess, a hostile press, and a public eager to decide who deserved punishment by breakfast. The year after the divorce, Andrew married Rosemary Pittman, a woman from a familiar social and racing world. The marriage suggested something telling. Andrew did not retreat into bitterness. He did not build a public identity around being wronged. He continued life in the manner he knew: family, horses, friends, service, ceremonies, and private loyalties. Rosemary gave him companionship outside the royal storm, and for a man so long cast as a supporting figure in other people's drama, that must have mattered. Camilla's future was much less settled. Charles loved her, but love did not make her acceptable. The Queen was cautious. The public remained hostile. Diana's popularity remained immense. The boys, William and Harry, had to be considered. Every move toward Camilla risked looking like an insult to Diana. Every move away from Camilla risked making Charles appear false to himself. The monarchy was trapped between morality, optics, and emotion, which is a poor place to build a timetable. Andrew could see all of this from a distance close enough to be informed and far enough to be spared some of the flames. His divorce had not solved the royal problem. It had simply removed his marriage from the pile of things being used to contain it. That, in the end, may be the most honest explanation of his choice. He did not divorce Camilla because he suddenly stopped understanding her. He divorced her because he understood the situation too well. He understood that she and Charles would not simply end. He understood that his marriage had become a screen nobody believed in. He understood that his children needed less pretense, not more. He understood that his own pride was not served by clinging to a public role that had become humiliating. And he understood that some endings must be done cleanly, not because the past was clean, but because the future will be filthy enough without dragging old curtains through it. The sadness is that there had once been a real marriage there, not a perfect one, not a faithful one, not one that history would treat gently, but real all the same. Camilla and Andrew had not been strangers performing a contract. They had laughed together, raised children, hosted friends, shared a culture, and known each other's faults with the intimacy that only long partnership can create. Their divorce was not the tearing up of a blank page. It was the closing of a heavily written book, with several pages stained, several missing, and a few still worth reading. That is what makes Andrew Parker Bowles so difficult to reduce. He was not simply the man Camilla left behind. He was part of the world that shaped her, part of the marriage that protected and confined her, part of the silence that allowed the affair to endure, and part of the restraint that kept the divorce from becoming even uglier. He was neither the fool of the story nor its secret saint. He was something more believable, a charming, flawed, proud, disciplined man who knew when the arrangement had ceased to work. And somewhere beneath the scandal, beneath the palace statements and newspaper cruelty, beneath Diana's pain and Charles's longing, there was a quieter truth that Andrew's behavior revealed better than any interview could have. He divorced Camilla not because one love ended and another began, but because their marriage had become the wrong answer to every question life was asking. It could not comfort Camilla. It could not protect Andrew. It could not shield the children. It could not fool the public. It could not help Charles. It could not heal Diana. It could only remain awkward and exposed, like a grand old umbrella turned inside out in a storm. And storms, as Andrew knew from a lifetime among horses, soldiers, and social disasters, have a way of teaching people which structures are real and which were only standing because no one had leaned on them hard enough. A storm does not end just because one household closes its door. By the time Andrew Parker Bowles and Camilla were divorced, the royal crisis had developed its own weather system. It moved over every person connected to Charles and Diana, and no one could quite predict where the lightning would strike next. Andrew had stepped out of the legal marriage, but he had not stepped out of the history. He was still the father of Camilla's children. He was still a familiar figure in the royal social world. He was still the man who knew too much, had said too little, and had somehow managed to make silence look less like retreat than strategy. That silence became more interesting after the divorce because the country expected bitterness. It wanted a final scene. It wanted Andrew to emerge from a doorway, square his shoulders, and give the nation the clean sentence it craved. Yes, he had been betrayed. Yes, he had suffered. Yes, Camilla had chosen the prince. Yes, he had finally thrown her out of his life with the righteous energy of a wronged husband in a melodrama. Instead, he behaved like Andrew Parker Bowles. He remarried in 1996. His new wife, Rosemary Pittman, came from a world that made sense to him, with horses, racing, friends, and the familiar codes of country life. It was not a marriage designed to compete with a palace scandal. It looked, to those who paid attention, like a man choosing companionship without turning his old pain into a profession. Rosemary was elegant, warm, and socially at ease. She understood the circles in which Andrew moved, and she did not need to be taught that in certain rooms the most important things are rarely said directly. That second marriage changed the shape of the story. Andrew was no longer simply the former husband of Camilla Parker Bowles. He was a husband again. He had made a new private life, while the public remained fascinated by the old one. This was a tidy act of defiance. He did not deny the past. He simply refused to live inside it for everyone else's convenience. Camilla, meanwhile, did not receive the same clean exit. Divorce had freed her from one impossible position and placed her in another. She was no longer married to Andrew, but she was still not publicly acceptable as the partner of Charles. If anything, her situation had become more exposed. Before the divorce, the public could pretend she was hidden behind a marriage. After it, the question was unavoidable. What was Charles going to do with the woman for whom he had risked so much? The answer, in the mid-1990s, was not much in public. Charles could not simply walk into daylight with Camilla on his arm. Diana was still alive, still beloved, and still carrying the moral power of the wounded wife. The princes, William and Harry, were boys growing through a family catastrophe that had already been more public than any childhood deserved. The Queen had to think not only as a mother, but as sovereign. The monarchy had to think in decades. Newspapers had to think in headlines before lunch. These clocks do not keep the same time. Camilla's public life shrank. She became for a while one of the most recognized women in Britain, and one of the least able to appear without being judged. That is a peculiar kind of fame. The face is known, but the person is not allowed to be complicated. She could not smile without seeming triumphant. She could not look tired without seeming guilty. She could not attend a party without someone treating the guest list like evidence. She had won nothing that looked like a prize. Andrew understood that because he knew the difference between Camilla the symbol and Camilla the woman. The symbol was useful to the press. The woman had once run his homes, raised his children, laughed with his friends, and endured far more than her enemies cared to imagine. He did not have to excuse every choice she made in order to know that the public version of her was brutal and incomplete. Diana's interview in 1995 made the situation even more charged. When she spoke about 3 people in her marriage, she gave the country a sentence it could repeat forever. It was devastating because it was simple. A complex emotional history was reduced to a dining table with one chair too many. Diana had the gift of making private pain legible to millions. She could take an ache inside a palace and make it feel familiar to a woman sitting in a suburban living room in Ohio, Sydney, Toronto, or Surrey. That was her power, and it was not imaginary. For Camilla, the sentence was a public branding. Her name did not need to be spoken. Everyone supplied it. For Charles, it was a blow that no careful interview could soften. For Andrew, it was another reminder that the marriage he had just left was still being discussed, as if it had belonged to the nation. He had not been one of the 3 in Diana's line, but his life had been arranged around the same table. The public simply had less interest in his chair. The monarchy then moved from embarrassment into damage control. In 1996, Charles and Diana divorced. The royal marriage that had begun with global celebration ended in legal settlement, title negotiations, and the strange sadness of a fairy tale being processed by solicitors. Diana lost the style of Royal Highness, though she remained Diana, Princess of Wales. Charles was free in law, but not free in feeling, image, or future. Camilla was divorced. Charles was divorced. On paper, the path had cleared. In real life, the path was full of broken glass. Andrew's divorce from Camilla had been quieter, but it had formed part of the same unravelling. First the private marriages cracked. Then the public marriages cracked. Then the old royal arrangements, which had relied on silence, deference, and patient concealment, found themselves exposed to a country that had learned to demand emotional truth. Whether emotional truth always made people wiser is another matter. It certainly made them watch. Andrew, from the side of this drama, had something Charles did not have: the freedom to become less interesting. That can be a blessing. He could attend to his new marriage, his family, his military and social commitments, and the familiar rituals that gave his life shape. He did not need the public to approve of his romantic choices in order to continue existing. A former cavalry officer with country friends can survive a poor headline. A future king has less room to hide. Camilla had no such freedom. She was not official enough to be protected, but too important to be ignored. Her friends and advisers, along with those around Charles, began the long project of making her visible in controlled steps. Not adored. That would have been asking too much. Not even accepted at first. Simply less shocking. A woman cannot become queen consort overnight if half the country still imagines her as the reason Diana cried into a camera. First, she must become less of a ghost. Then less of a scandal. Then perhaps a person. This was a slow campaign, and slow campaigns require discipline. Camilla had to appear without seeming to push. Charles had to support her without seeming to insult Diana. The palace had to adjust without looking as if it had surrendered to adultery. It was a delicate dance performed in shoes made of eggshell. Somewhere in the background, Andrew's continued civility helped more than people realized. Had Andrew raged publicly, every attempt to rehabilitate Camilla would have met a living accusation. Had he denounced her, the wronged husband would have become a weapon in every headline. Had he turned Tom and Laura into symbols of damaged family life, Camilla would have looked not only like Diana's rival, but like a destroyer of her own home. Andrew did none of this. His restraint did not erase the scandal, but it denied the scandal one of its most useful props. This is why his role matters. Andrew did not merely divorce Camilla and vanish. He created a kind of social permission for others to behave calmly. If he, the former husband, could remain civil, then friends could remain civil. If the children could keep relationships with both parents, then the world did not have to imagine the Parker Bowles family as a battlefield. If Andrew could remarry and move forward, then Camilla's past marriage looked less like an open wound and more like a complicated chapter that had closed. It was not forgiveness in the sentimental sense. It was something cooler and perhaps more durable. It was order. Then, in August 1997, everything changed. Diana died in Paris after a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. The news travelled around the world with the force of a collective gasp. Whatever judgments people had made before, whatever positions they had taken in the War of Wales, the death of a young mother at 36 transformed the entire story. Grief swept through Britain and far beyond it. Flowers piled outside Kensington Palace. People wept in public. The monarchy, used to formal mourning, faced something raw and more unpredictable. Diana had become, in death, even more powerful than she had been in life. For Charles, the loss was personal, parental, public, and historical all at once. He had to bring home the body of the former wife with whom he had shared love, conflict, children, and catastrophe. He had to care for William and Harry, boys whose grief was now being watched by millions. He had to stand inside national sorrow while carrying the knowledge that many mourners still blamed him and blamed Camilla for Diana's suffering. For Camilla, Diana's death was not liberation, it was a moral earthquake. Any hope of appearing openly beside Charles became almost unthinkable in the immediate aftermath. The public grief for Diana left no room for the woman many saw as her rival. Camilla had already been disliked. After Diana died, dislike hardened into something colder in many hearts. Even people who had little knowledge of the private facts felt they knew enough to judge. Andrew's position, again, was peculiar. His former wife was now the most hated woman in Britain to some, while his former romantic rival, if one can use such a phrase for a future king, was grieving the mother of his sons under the eyes of the world. Andrew had known Diana. He knew Charles. He knew Camilla. He knew how much of the public story was true, how much was simplified, and how much had been sharpened into cruelty. He also knew that now was not the time for explanations. There are moments when the only decent act is not to add words. Andrew was good at that. The death of Diana also changed the meaning of Andrew's divorce. Before 1997, some could imagine the end of his marriage as one more step toward Charles and Camilla becoming official. After Diana's death, that path seemed blocked by grief, guilt, and public fury. Andrew had divorced Camilla because the marriage no longer made sense, but the future waiting outside it had become more uncertain than ever. Camilla was free, but freedom is a thin blanket when the country is standing outside your window with a verdict. For Tom and Laura, the situation was again painful in a quieter way. Their mother was being condemned in language that rarely left space for them. They had lost no mother in the crash, but they had lost something too, the hope that the world might one day discuss their family with restraint. Diana's sons were rightly at the center of sympathy. Camilla's children were expected to endure the public fury almost invisibly. Scandal creates ranks of grief, and those placed lower in the order are still bruised. Andrew's continuing steadiness gave Tom and Laura a kind of anchor. He had not chosen a war with their mother. He had not tried to cleanse himself by blackening her. He had not made them choose. In a family marked by divorce and public disgrace, that mattered. It may not have made headlines, but children do not grow up inside headlines alone. They grow up inside houses, phone calls, holiday arrangements, and the tone one parent uses when speaking of the other. Andrew's tone, at least in public, remained controlled. Charles, after Diana's death, had to move with extreme caution. Any attempt to bring Camilla forward too quickly would have looked indecent. The Queen and advisers understood the danger. The public needed time, and perhaps time was not enough. Diana had left behind memory, images, interviews, dresses, charities, sons, and a myth that could not be negotiated with. Camilla had to compete not with a woman, but with a beloved ghost. No one wins that contest. The best one can do is survive until the ghost becomes part of history rather than daily weather. Andrew's life with Rosemary continued. This matters not because it was dramatic, but because it was normal. Normality in this story is almost radical. While Charles and Camilla were trapped in national symbolism, Andrew was building a marriage that did not require constitutional discussion. Rosemary was not a rebound written for gossip columns. She was his companion in a world of racing, friends and family. They appeared together. They lived. They carried on. The phrase sounds dull, but in British upper-class life, carrying on is not a small talent. It is practically a minor religion. Camilla also carried on, though with less ease. She remained close to Charles, but their public appearances were carefully managed. The first significant steps toward public acceptance came slowly. A birthday party here, a photographed exit there, a charitable role, a controlled introduction. Nothing too sudden, nothing that could be interpreted as triumph. Her handlers understood something essential. Camilla could not be sold as glamorous. She could not be sold as Diana's replacement. She had to be presented as what she actually was, a steady, middle-aged woman who loved Charles and could support him without drama. It was not a fairy tale pitch. It was more like offering the public a sensible umbrella after a hurricane. The older audience, the one that remembered divorce as scandal and duty as a serious word, had mixed feelings. Some never forgave her. Some slowly softened. Some disliked the affair but respected the endurance. Some looked at Charles, no longer young, and saw a man who had made a disastrous first marriage under pressure and had loved the same woman for decades. Others saw only selfishness dressed as destiny. The debate did not end because the facts could support more than one feeling. Andrew's lack of public anger made softening easier for some. If the man once married to Camilla could stand near the story without spitting fire, perhaps there was more to understand. That was not an argument anyone placed on a palace poster. It worked quietly, as social cues often do. People watch how insiders behave. They may not admit it, but they do. Andrew's behavior suggested that whatever had happened inside the marriage, it had not left a simple trail of hatred. This is the point where the word reveal becomes misleading if taken too literally. Andrew did not need to sit beneath studio lights at 86 and deliver a confession for the truth to become visible. His revelation lay in the pattern of his choices. He divorced without vengeance. He remarried without performance. He remained connected without clinging. He allowed his children to love their mother without asking them to avenge him. He attended events where lesser men might have stayed away just to make a point. In a world obsessed with statements, his conduct became the statement. But conduct does not erase the harder questions. Did Andrew's own affairs make it easier for Camilla to justify hers? Did his tolerance come from generosity, or from the fact that he could not claim a cleaner record? Did he stay married longer than was healthy because the old-class code rewarded appearances over honesty? Did Camilla rely on his discretion while building a life of emotional intimacy elsewhere? Did Charles, with all his sensitivity, fail to see the full cost of his dependence on another man's wife? The answer to most of these questions is uncomfortable. Yes, at least partly. That is what gives the story its weight. No one emerges untouched. Andrew had charm and discipline, but he also benefited from a social order that excused male wandering until it became inconvenient. Camilla had warmth and resilience, but she also participated in a relationship that deepened Diana's pain. Charles had long-lasting love and genuine emotional need, but he also caused damage because need does not absolve consequence. Diana had real suffering and extraordinary public grace, but she too became part of the machinery of exposure once silence failed her. Human beings rarely enter history as polished statues. They arrive with fingerprints on everything. The late 1990s forced everyone to live with those fingerprints. Camilla's rehabilitation could not be rushed because Diana's memory was too fresh. Charles's future could not be decided solely by private love because the monarchy is never solely private. Andrew could not rewrite his marriage as a pure victim story because too many people knew the old world and too many complications sat at the table. The children, all of them, had to grow into adulthood under the weight of decisions made before they could fully understand them. In those years, Andrew's social intelligence proved more valuable than dramatic confession. He knew how to remain present without taking center stage. He knew when to attend, when to withdraw, when to say nothing, and when a smile across a room could prevent 3 days of speculation. These are not romantic qualities, but they are powerful in a society built on signals. Andrew was fluent in signals. He had been speaking that language all his life. Camilla slowly returned to public view. She appeared at events connected to Charles. She began to be seen not as a hidden mistress, but as a partner waiting to be acknowledged. The difference was enormous. A hidden mistress belongs to scandal. A partner belongs perhaps one day to biography. The shift required patience, and patience required support from people who did not fan old flames for attention. Andrew's support was not loud, but it was there in the absence of sabotage. He did not give interviews designed to wound her. He did not embarrass Charles. He did not let the divorce become a permanent accusation. In family terms, he allowed the next chapter to exist. That may not sound heroic. It is also rarer than people think. By the end of the decade, the outlines of the future were beginning to show, though faintly. Charles would not abandon Camilla. Camilla would not disappear. The monarchy would have to find a way to accommodate a relationship it had once treated as impossible. Andrew would remain part of the extended family landscape, no longer central, never irrelevant. Diana's memory would continue to shape every step. The public would slowly, unevenly decide whether endurance could soften judgment. And the divorce, seen from that distance, looked less like a single answer and more like the hinge on which several lives turned. Before it, Camilla was trapped in a marriage that had become fiction. After it, she was exposed to a future that had no guarantees. Before it, Andrew was the husband in a scandal. After it, he became the man who could have made everything worse and chose not to. Before it, Charles and Camilla existed inside denial. After it, denial began to give way to the harder task of consequence. That is why Andrew Parker Bowles remains one of the most quietly revealing figures in the story. He did not command the cameras. He did not inherit the throne. He did not become a national martyr. He simply occupied the uncomfortable place where private marriage, royal love, social code, and public judgment met. From that place he made choices that showed why the marriage ended more clearly than any speech would have done. He divorced Camilla because the marriage had stopped being a refuge and had become a stage. He remained civil because the woman on that stage was still the mother of his children. He remarried because life, unlike scandal, has to continue past the headline. He stayed silent because he belonged to a world where silence could be armor, mercy, pride, and accusation all at once. And in the years after Diana's death, as Camilla waited in the half-light between disgrace and acceptance, Andrew's silence followed the story like a well-trained horse at a funeral. Steady, disciplined, impossible to ignore once you noticed it, and carrying more history than it appeared to bear. The half-light did not flatter anyone. By the end of the 1990s, Camilla had become a public test for the monarchy. Not a person first, not in the eyes of the nation. A test. Could Britain accept the woman who had been blamed for helping break the marriage of Charles and Diana? Could the royal family admit that the future king's private life had not followed the fairy tale sold to the world? Could Charles have the woman he loved without making the crown look as if it rewarded pain with promotion? These were large questions, but the answers began in small ways. A doorway, a birthday party, a photograph taken at the right moment, or the wrong one, depending on who was looking. In January 1999, Charles and Camilla appeared together publicly after a 50th birthday party for Camilla's sister, Annabel. It was not a grand royal arrival. It was not a balcony moment. It was a carefully managed emergence, almost painfully cautious. They left the Ritz in London together, with cameras waiting, and the world saw what it had long known, but had not been officially invited to see. Charles and Camilla were a couple. It sounds simple now, but at the time it was a serious crossing. For years their relationship had been discussed as scandal, betrayal, whisper, and moral wound. That evening nudged it toward public fact. No trumpets sounded. No one handed Camilla a tiara at the door. The monarchy does not usually move that quickly unless a horse is bolted. But the image mattered. It began the work of turning Camilla from a hidden figure into a visible companion. Andrew Parker Bowles did not stand in the frame, but his absence from conflict helped make that frame possible. He had divorced Camilla. He had remarried. He had not become a professional victim. He had not rushed forward to declare himself betrayed before every camera in London. In a story where silence had often been used to conceal damage, Andrew's silence now served another purpose. It allowed other people to stop treating his old marriage as an open wound that needed reopening for inspection. A bitter former husband could have haunted every step of Camilla's return. Andrew did not. He remained civil. That civility was not sentimental. It had bones. It came from pride, habit, affection, and the practical understanding that Tom and Laura would be the ones hurt if their parents turned the past into a public contest. Andrew knew the value of a clean exit, even when the road behind it had been muddy. Camilla's children were adults by then, but adults can still be wounded by the public treatment of a parent. Tom Parker Bowles had grown into a writer and food critic, a profession that requires courage of a particular sort, because one must tell the truth about restaurants and then possibly return to them. Laura had moved into the art world, more private than her brother and less inclined toward public performance. Both had spent years watching their mother turned into a national shorthand. They knew the woman behind the caricature. They also knew that defending her too loudly could simply feed the machine. Andrew's restraint gave them room to live with both parents intact. That may be one of the least dramatic and most important consequences of the divorce. He did not make loyalty expensive. He did not demand payment in anger. In many divorced families, the children become messengers, judges, or trophies. In this one, with half the world peering through the curtains that could have been disastrous, Instead, the family found a way to remain a family, altered but not shattered. Camilla's slow return required more than Andrew's quietness, of course. It required Charles's determination. Whatever one thinks of his choices, he did not drift away from her when life became inconvenient. If convenience had been his guiding principle, he would have fled years earlier and taken up a hobby that caused fewer constitutional tremors, perhaps watercolors in a locked room. But Charles stayed. He was stubborn in love, and stubbornness is not always noble, but it is rarely boring. He had spent much of his life feeling misunderstood. Camilla understood him. That was the foundation. She listened to him when he spoke of architecture, countryside, faith, farming, books, and the heavy oddness of being born into a role that belonged to the public before it belonged to him. She made him laugh when the world made him stiff. She punctured his gloom without mocking his seriousness. For a man trained from childhood to be looked at, there was immense relief in being known. The monarchy's challenge was to make that private truth publicly bearable. Camilla could not be presented as a young romantic heroine. She was not young, not untouched by scandal, and not wrapped in mist. The better strategy was plainness. She was steady, she was loyal to Charles, she liked country life, she worked without fuss. She did not try to outshine anyone. She was not a replacement for Diana because no one could replace Diana, and any attempt would have been both foolish and fatal. Camilla had to be something less theatrical and more durable, the woman Charles would not give up. This required a careful adjustment of royal etiquette. At first, Camilla attended events as Charles's companion, but not with the full standing of a future wife. Every appearance was measured. How close did she stand? Who greeted her? Was the Queen present? Was Prince William there? What did the photograph suggest? A royal court can make a yard of carpet feel like a constitutional document. For older viewers who remembered the old rules, the situation was unsettling. Divorce had become more common, but royalty was still expected to provide a cleaner image than ordinary life. That expectation was unreasonable, but deeply held. The royal family was paid in deference partly because it offered continuity, ceremony, and a fantasy of order. Charles and Camilla had brought disorder into the front hall and asked whether anyone wanted tea. Andrew, by comparison, offered a different kind of order. He continued attending events where his presence might have made others nervous. He did so without drama. He was not frozen out of royal circles, nor did he appear desperate to cling to them. He had been close to Princess Anne for decades, maintained connections within the family, and remained part of the social fabric that had always surrounded the Windsors. This mattered because it showed that the people closest to the story did not behave as if Camilla's past marriage had ended in poison. The public often expects divorce to create permanent camps. Andrew refused the arrangement. He did not act as if Camilla's new life erased their shared past, nor did he act as if the past entitled him to control the future. That balance is harder than it looks. Many people speak nobly about moving on while keeping a small museum of grievances open in the basement. Andrew seemed to have locked the museum, or at least restricted visiting hours. The early 2000s brought new tests. Camilla began to take on more visible charitable work. This was essential. A royal woman cannot be accepted merely as someone's romantic choice. She must be seen doing the work, visiting hospitals, supporting causes, standing in chilly halls while speeches run longer than mercy permits, shaking hands with people who may not all admire her, and doing it without flinching. Royal acceptance is not only emotional, it is occupational. Camilla was suited to this in a way her critics underestimated. She did not have Diana's glamour, but she had stamina. She was good with people because she was not brittle. She could talk to farmers, soldiers, old ladies, children, and nervous officials with the same practical warmth. She did not float into a room expecting wonder. She entered as if there might be a dog under the table and someone had better make sure it had water. That quality, unfashionable as it may sound, made her useful. Slowly the public temperature changed. Not everywhere, not completely. Some people would never forgive her. Some still saw Diana's pain and could not separate Camilla from it. Others began to distinguish between the cruelty of the public story and the complexity of the private one. Time does not erase scandal, but it wears down its sharpest edges. People who had once demanded punishment began to grow tired of the shouting. Charles was not going to marry a fantasy princess. Diana was gone. The boys were growing up. Camilla was still there. Andrew's life remained a quiet counterpoint. His marriage to Rosemary was stable and affectionate by all public signs. He appeared at society and family occasions. He continued to carry himself with the brisk ease of a man who had seen too much to be easily startled. If the past embarrassed him, he did not let it become his public costume. This is important because it challenges the simple theory that he divorced Camilla out of rage. Rage consumes. Andrew did not appear consumed. The divorce looks more and more like a decision made when the marriage had become unworkable, not a revenge strike delivered in sudden fury. There was, of course, pride. There had to be. Andrew Parker Bowles was not a saint carved from restraint and polished by suffering. He was a man of his class and time, and pride was part of the uniform even when he was not wearing one. He had been humiliated by the public exposure of Camilla's relationship with Charles. He had been forced into a national story in which his marriage was discussed as though it were a misplaced umbrella. Pride would have pushed him to reclaim his own life. Divorce helped him do that. But pride alone does not explain the civility that followed. Pride can make a person gracious if the graciousness proves superiority. It can also make a person vengeful if the wound is fresh. Andrew chose the first path often enough that it became significant. He did not forgive in a grand public speech. He forgave, or at least accepted, through behavior. He kept showing up when appropriate. He kept the family lines open. He allowed the past to remain complicated without trying to simplify it in his favor. The palace, meanwhile, faced the unavoidable. Charles and Camilla's relationship had survived everything. Marriage, divorce, humiliation, Diana's death, public anger, years of careful silence, and years of careful appearances. At some point, endurance becomes evidence. It may not prove innocence, but it proves seriousness. The monarchy could not indefinitely treat the future king's partner as a problem to be hidden behind flower arrangements. Prince William and Prince Harry were central to the next stage. Public acceptance mattered, but family acceptance mattered more. Charles could not build a future with Camilla if his sons were visibly wounded by it. Their mother's memory stood between every step. They had suffered enough without being turned into symbols in another adult argument. Gradually they met Camilla and came to terms with her presence in their father's life. This was not a fairy tale reconciliation. It was family realism. People adapt because life does not ask permission to continue. Camilla's path required humility, or at least the appearance of it, and in this case the two were probably not far apart. She could not enter the prince's lives as a triumphant rival. She had to be patient, careful, and aware that their grief had a claim no romance could outrank. The fact that she eventually became part of the family structure speaks not to instant warmth, but to time, manners, and the difficult kindness of not forcing feelings to arrive before they are ready. Andrew knew something about that kind of patience. His own relationship with Camilla had shifted from young romance to marriage, from marriage to arrangement, from arrangement to divorce, and from divorce to family alliance. Few people get through that many transformations without either wisdom or exhaustion. In Andrew's case, it may have been both. He understood that a relationship can stop being one thing without needing to become nothing. That understanding shaped everything after the divorce. By 2002, the royal family was hit by another pair of losses. Princess Margaret died in February. The Queen Mother died in March at the age of 101. These deaths closed an era. The Queen Mother, especially, had represented the old royal world of wartime resolve, strict codes, and immense public affection. She had also been seen as no admirer of Camilla's place in Charles's life. With her passing, and with Princess Margaret gone too, the emotional architecture around the Queen shifted. The monarchy was aging. The next reign, once theoretical, moved closer. Charles's future could not remain unresolved forever. If he was to become king one day, the place of the woman beside him had to be settled, not only for love but for state clarity. The British are famously good at tolerating muddle until the muddle threatens the seating order at a national service. Then everyone suddenly discovers a passion for definitions. Camilla's public role continued to expand. She attended the Golden Jubilee events in 2002, though with careful choreography. Every royal occasion became a lesson in degrees of acceptance. The Queen's presence mattered. The public photographs mattered. The press tone mattered. Still, the direction was clear. Camilla was no longer being erased. She was being introduced slowly, as someone who would remain. Andrew's conduct again worked as quiet ballast. He did not undermine the process. He did not remind the public, at every opportunity, that Camilla had once been his wife. He did not claim permanent ownership of the grievance. This was not only generous toward Camilla, it was protective of himself. A man who keeps reopening his old wound teaches the world where to press. Andrew did not give that lesson. The question of marriage between Charles and Camilla grew louder. For years, it had seemed impossible, then merely difficult, then perhaps inevitable. The obstacles were real. Both were divorced. Their relationship had begun during earlier marriages, or at least deepened during them. The Church of England had its concerns about remarriage after divorce, especially for a future supreme governor of the Church. The public had its concerns too, expressed less in theology and more in the tone people use when saying, "Well, I remember Diana." The solution required both legal and symbolic care. Charles and Camilla would not have a grand cathedral wedding. That would have seemed too triumphant, too bridal, too forgetful of the wreckage behind them. Instead, when the engagement was announced in February 2005, the plan was for a civil ceremony followed by a blessing. It was a compromise, which is to say it pleased nobody entirely, but allowed history to move. The engagement itself was a remarkable moment. Camilla, once the hidden woman, the blamed woman, the woman newspapers mocked without mercy, was going to marry the Prince of Wales. Not in youth, not in innocence, not in the glowing first act of life. In the late middle of the story, after divorce, death, scandal, humiliation, and years of waiting. There was romance in that, though not the clean kind sold on commemorative plates. It was battered romance, with legal advice and awkward relatives. More realistic, perhaps, but harder to embroider. What did Andrew make of it? Publicly, very little, which by now was the expected answer and the most revealing one. He did not object. He did not wound. He did not insist on being central. His children would be involved in the new blended family reality. Tom was Charles's godson and Camilla's son, a link so tangled it almost required a map and a strong drink. Laura, too, had to navigate the strange fact that her mother was marrying the future king, while her father remained part of the same extended social world. Andrew's calm made that navigation less cruel. There is a dignity in not turning every personal loss into a public invoice. Andrew seemed to understand that the bill for those years had already been paid by too many people. Diana, Charles, Camilla, himself, and most painfully, all the children. Adding interest would not make anyone richer. The wedding took place on April 9, 2005, at the Guildhall in Windsor. Even the date had shifted because of the funeral of Pope John Paul II, a reminder that history enjoys making logistics out of emotion. The ceremony was civil, modest by royal standards, and followed by a blessing at St. George's Chapel. The Queen did not attend the civil ceremony, but she did attend the blessing and reception. That distinction said everything in the careful language of monarchy. The marriage was accepted. It was also being handled with the gloves still on. Camilla became Duchess of Cornwall, not Princess of Wales in public use, although legally she held that rank. This was not a small decision. The title Princess of Wales belonged in the public heart to Diana. To use it would have looked like a provocation, even if technically proper. Duchess of Cornwall was safer, softer, less haunted. It allowed Camilla a role without forcing the country to imagine her stepping directly into Diana's shoes. Some shoes are not meant to be filled. They are placed behind glass and argued over forever. Andrew attended the wedding blessing. That fact, simple as it is, carries enormous meaning. The former husband was present as Camilla married the man whose place in her life had helped end their marriage. In a cheap drama, this would be impossible. In the British upper classes, it was difficult but manageable. provided everyone had been properly dressed and no one mistook restraint for lack of feeling. His attendance was not a small courtesy. It was a statement made without a microphone. It told the family, the court, the friends, and the public that the old war would not be fought at the chapel door. It told Tom and Laura that their father would not turn their mother's wedding into a scene. It told Charles that Andrew would not use history as a weapon on a day already heavy with ghosts. And it told Camilla that whatever had happened, their shared life had not ended in hatred. That is perhaps the clearest answer Andrew ever gave to the question of why he divorced her. If he had divorced her because he despised her, he would not have stood anywhere near that blessing. If he had divorced her only because Charles had stolen her, he might have made absence his revenge. Instead he appeared, not as a defeated man, not as a celebrant pretending the past had been painless, as the former husband, the father, the old friend, the disciplined figure who understood that family survival sometimes requires walking into rooms history has made absurd. The absurdity should not be ignored. There was Camilla, now married to Charles after decades of love and scandal. There was Andrew, her former husband, socially connected, remarried, civil. There was the Queen, accepting what once seemed unthinkable. There were William and Harry, sons of Diana, watching their father's life settle into a shape that had once caused their mother anguish. There were Tom and Laura, children of Andrew and Camilla, seeing their mother become royal in a way that would change their own lives without making them royal. It was less a family tree than a garden after a storm, with several branches at strange angles and everyone politely pretending the gardener had planned it. Camilla's new marriage did not erase the old one. It made the old one more important. Without Andrew, there was no full understanding of what she had left, what had protected her, what had confined her, and what had allowed her eventually to stand beside Charles. Andrew had been husband, rival, shield, witness, and finally, proof that the past could be carried without being thrown. After 2005, Camilla began the long work of becoming useful in the monarchy. The wedding did not magically make her beloved. It made her official. There is a large difference. Official status gives a person a title, a schedule, and better security. It does not give affection. Affection has to be earned in small installments, often from people who do not wish to pay. She worked, she visited charities. She supported causes around literacy, domestic abuse, osteoporosis, animal welfare, and older people. She stood beside Charles at home and abroad. She wore the hats. She smiled through the ceremonies. She made mistakes and recovered from them. She learned the rhythm of royal work as a woman in her late 50s, which is not the age most people choose to begin a national probation period. Yet she did it with a steadiness that slowly changed the conversation. Andrew remained in the background, but the background was not empty. His continued relationship with Camilla and the wider family helped normalize what had once seemed impossible. The divorced husband who attends the wedding blessing and later appears at family occasions tells the world quietly that private life is not always arranged according to public appetite. The people involved had made their accommodations. The public could catch up or not. History, as usual, had already moved chairs. It is important not to make Andrew too noble. He was flawed. His own infidelities had hurt Camilla. His old social world had excused men like him while judging women more harshly. He benefited from rules that bruised others, but it is also important not to make him small. In the years when he could have turned bitterness into attention, he chose discretion. In the moment when his former wife married the future king, he chose presence over protest. In the long aftermath, he chose family over spectacle. This is why the divorce cannot be understood as a simple rejection. Andrew did not cut Camilla out of his life. He cut the legal fiction of their marriage away from a reality that had outgrown it. The emotional bond changed. The family bond remained. The social bond remained. The mutual history remained. The divorce did not say, "You are dead to me." It said, more painfully and more accurately, "We cannot live as husband and wife anymore, and pretending has become more damaging than ending it." By the time Camilla became Duchess of Cornwall, that truth had settled into the family's behavior. Andrew had moved on without disappearing. Camilla had moved into royal life without denying her past. Charles had married the woman he had loved for decades, but the marriage came not as a conquest, more as a settlement after a very long war. Diana's memory remained not as a closed chapter, but as a presence no one could safely ignore. And somewhere beneath the cathedral music, the carefully chosen titles, the civil ceremony, the blessing, the reception, and the nation's cautious watchfulness, Andrew Parker Bowles had already revealed the heart of it. He divorced Camilla because their marriage had become a room full of people who no longer belonged there in the same way. Then, years later, he attended her wedding because leaving a room is not the same as burning down the house. That distinction, quiet and almost old-fashioned, may be the most Andrew thing about the entire story. Leaving a room is easier than learning how to share a corridor afterward. After Camilla married Charles in 2005, Andrew Parker Bowles did not vanish into the honourable mist. He remained where the story had always placed him, not at the centre, never entirely outside it, part family, part witness, part reminder that royal romance had not arrived without wreckage. His presence after the wedding blessing mattered because it showed that the old marriage had not been erased. It had been converted into something quieter, stranger, and in some ways more durable than anyone expected. For Camilla, becoming Duchess of Cornwall was not a triumphal arrival. It was more like being admitted into a house where half the guests remembered exactly why they had not wanted you invited. She had a title, staff, duties, security, and a place beside Charles. What she did not have was universal forgiveness, and she was sensible enough to know that demanding it would only make things worse. Forgiveness cannot be ordered by palace memo, even on very thick paper. She began where she could. She worked. That is not a glamorous sentence, but it is the sentence that changed her life. She visited hospitals, opened centers, met charity workers, talked to women who had suffered domestic abuse, supported literacy campaigns, and spoke about osteoporosis, a cause that had personal meaning because her mother and grandmother had both suffered from it. None of this produced the instant glow of national affection, but it did something more useful. It made her visible doing steady, unshowy work. This mattered because for years the public had seen Camilla only through scandal. Scandal is a cruel editor. It cuts away daily kindness, family loyalty, awkward courage, and service that does not photograph well. It leaves only the sharpest outline. As Duchess of Cornwall, Camilla had to fill in the rest of the picture one visit at a time. She could not outshine Diana, and she did not try. She could not charm the nation with youth, glamour, or tragic vulnerability. Those roles were taken and sealed by memory. Camilla's only route was usefulness. That suited her better than performance. She was not at her best when asked to look symbolic. She was at her best when allowed to be practical. With farmers, veterans, elderly women, schoolchildren, charity volunteers, and authors at literacy events, she could do what she had always done in drawing rooms and country houses, make people feel less stiff. She asked simple questions. She listened. She laughed without polishing the laugh into something ceremonial. There was no mistaking her for a fairy tale princess, which by then may have been part of the relief. Charles changed too. Marriage to Camilla gave him a private steadiness he had lacked for decades. He was still serious, still full of causes, still inclined to speak passionately about buildings, farming, faith, and the environment long after other people's eyes began looking for the exits. But beside Camilla, his public manner softened. She could puncture his solemnity with a glance. She could coax him out of the dark rooms of his own mind. She knew when to soothe him and when to tease him, which is a skill no courtier can learn from a handbook. To people who disliked Camilla, this was not enough. They saw comfort bought at too high a price. To others, especially as time passed, Charles and Camilla began to look less like a scandal, and more like two older people who had made a terrible mess in youth and middle age, then survived long enough to become ordinary together. Ordinary was useful. The monarchy had plenty of gold. It had less ordinary. Andrew watched this transformation from a distance that was close enough to feel, but far enough not to govern. His own life with Rosemary remained important. She had given him a new marriage outside the storm, and those years should not be treated as a footnote merely because they did not involve a prince. Rosemary was part of Andrew's return to himself after the long public awkwardness of being Camilla's husband. She belonged to a world of racing, friends and family, and she seems to have understood that marrying Andrew meant marrying a man with history still walking around in full view. Andrew's second marriage also complicated the easy tale of injury. He did not spend the years after Camilla's royal wedding as a deserted man muttering at the edge of society. He carried on with dignity, pleasure and purpose. He had survived the end of one marriage and built another. That does not mean the past did not hurt. It means he refused to let hurt become his whole occupation. There is a quiet authority in that, especially in an age when pain can so easily be turned into a public brand. The family web remained tangled but functioning. Tom and Laura were Camilla's children with Andrew, but they now stood beside a mother married to the Prince of Wales. They were not royal, yet they were suddenly adjacent to royalty in a way far more intense than before. Their stepfather was the future king. Their father was a former cavalry officer with deep royal connections. Their mother was the woman much of the public was still deciding whether to forgive. If the family ever needed a simple Christmas seating chart, it had missed its chance sometime around 1973. Tom handled his position with a kind of cheerful worldliness. As a food writer and broadcaster, he made his own name rather than living entirely inside his mother's title. He could speak about food, restaurants, and cooking with authority, which was useful because a plate of roast chicken is often less politically dangerous than a royal marriage. Laura remained more private, working in the art world and raising her family away from the hottest lights. Both children had to manage the oddity of seeing their mother become a public institution while still knowing her as the woman who had raised them. Andrew's relationship with them was central. He remained their father, not the discarded figure in someone else's love story. That distinction matters. In families touched by scandal, children often become absorbed into the public narrative as evidence. Andrew's steadiness helped prevent that. He had no need to compete with Charles as a public figure in their lives. He had the deeper claim of fatherhood, and fatherhood does not need trumpets unless it is insecure. Camilla's grandchildren added another layer. To them, she was not the most controversial woman of the 1990s. She was a grandmother. Children have a magnificent talent for ignoring national mythology when snacks are available. In their company, Camilla could be ordinary in the most healing sense, affectionate, amused, slightly bossy when necessary, and more interested in bedtime than headlines. That domestic identity softened her, not because it was a public relations trick, but because it was real. A woman who has been flattened by scandal becomes harder to hate when seen with muddy dogs, grandchildren, and the tired patience of family life. Then life, as it tends to do, brought grief back into Andrew's world. Rosemary Parker Bowles died in 2010 after illness. Her death was a genuine loss, and it returned Andrew to widowerhood after years of companionship. Once again, he did not turn grief into theatre. The death of a second wife placed him in a quieter, more solitary position, but not an isolated one. His old ties remained. His children remained. Camilla, now Duchess of Cornwall, remained part of his wider family world. The bond between Andrew and Camilla after Rosemary's death is one of the most revealing aspects of the whole story. Many divorced couples cannot manage a civil birthday card. Andrew and Camilla managed decades of family life after a scandal that had once filled the newspapers. This does not happen by accident. It requires restraint, memory, shared affection, and the decision not to make the children pay forever for the parents' failures. It also requires a certain old-fashioned social discipline. They had both been raised to understand that personal discomfort does not excuse bad manners in public. The British upper classes have many sins, but they can produce a formidable ability to stand beside someone complicated and discuss the weather as if civilization depends on it. Sometimes it does. In those years, Camilla's acceptance grew slowly. She accompanied Charles on overseas tours. She attended state occasions. She supported the Queen at major events. The woman once seen as a threat to the monarchy became one of its more reliable workers. This was not because the public forgot Diana. It did not. Diana remained a permanent emotional presence, especially for those who had watched her wedding, her loneliness, her interviews, her funeral, and the two sons walking behind her coffin. But memory can make room without surrendering. Over time, many people learned to hold two truths at once. Diana had been wronged and beloved, and Camilla was now part of Charles's life and the royal family's future. That was the adult conclusion, and adult conclusions rarely satisfy those who prefer battles with clean uniforms. Camilla's strength lay in not demanding emotional surrender. She did not ask the public to pretend the past had been lovely. She simply kept appearing, kept working, kept standing beside Charles, and kept letting the years pass. This was perhaps the only strategy that could have worked. Scandal loves urgency. Rehabilitation loves repetition. The same face at enough charity visits, in enough rain, shaking enough hands, begins to move from outrage into routine. Routine is not love, but it is the road love sometimes takes when there has been too much damage for shortcuts. Andrew's own routine remained woven through military events, racing circles, family occasions, and royal ceremonies. He had been a commanding officer, a respected figure in cavalry life, and a man at ease among the rituals of service. Those rituals gave him identity beyond Camilla, beyond Charles, beyond the old triangle. That mattered because the public story had narrowed him into one role, the divorced husband. In real life, he was father, grandfather, former officer, friend, widower, and a man with a long record of moving through difficult rooms without breaking the furniture. The relationship between Andrew and the royal family stayed unusually warm. His long friendship with Princess Anne endured, and his presence at royal events suggested that the monarchy did not consider him an embarrassment. Quite the opposite. He had become one of those figures who, by continuing to behave well, made everyone else's situation easier. There is a sort of social genius in that. Not brilliance of speech, not dramatic sacrifice, but the ability to absorb awkwardness and leave the room steadier than one found it. As Queen Elizabeth II grew older, the question of Camilla's future title became more serious. For years, the official line had been that when Charles became king, Camilla would be known as Princess Consort rather than Queen. This was a careful compromise from the time of the marriage, designed to calm public anxiety. It allowed people to accept Camilla without being asked to imagine her immediately as queen. The word queen still belonged emotionally to Elizabeth and in another way to the memory of Diana as the lost future. Camilla's path to that title was not blocked by law so much as by feeling, and feeling is often more stubborn than law. Charles wanted Camilla recognized properly. That desire was not merely vanity on her behalf. In royal tradition, the wife of a king is normally queen consort. To deny Camilla that title permanently would suggest that the marriage itself remained morally incomplete, tolerated but not honored. Charles had spent decades feeling that the woman he loved had been treated as a problem to be managed. As he moved closer to the throne, he wanted the settlement to be clear. The Queen's view mattered above all. Elizabeth II had lived through the abdication crisis as a child, watched her uncle give up the throne for Wallis Simpson, seen her father's life redirected by duty, and then spent her own reign guarding the monarchy from personal drama. She had reasons to be cautious about Charles and Camilla. She had also lived long enough to watch Camilla work. The Queen valued steadiness. Camilla, whatever the past, had become steady. In February 2022, on the eve of the 70th anniversary of her accession, the Queen expressed her sincere wish that Camilla would be known as Queen Consort when Charles became king. It was a decisive moment, delivered in the Queen's calm language, which could make an earthquake sound like a parish notice. The statement did not erase history, but it changed the constitutional and emotional landscape. Camilla was no longer merely tolerated as Charles's wife. She had been publicly endorsed by the sovereign. For Camilla, this was perhaps the most important act of acceptance she ever received. Not because it made everyone love her, it did not, but because it ended the official uncertainty. The Queen, who had carried the monarchy through war memory, family scandal, social change, and 70 years of public duty, had given her blessing to Camilla's future place. That could not be dismissed as gossip, spin, or romantic wishful thinking. It was the Crown speaking in its most measured voice. For Andrew, watching from his unique position, the moment must have carried strange echoes. The woman he had married in 1973, the woman whose relationship with Charles had helped undo their marriage, the woman once mocked and blamed, was now being prepared for the title of Queen Consort. If Andrew felt bitterness, he did not show it. If he felt irony, he had enough material to dine out for several years without repeating himself. But again, his public conduct remained steady. This is where the headline question changes shape. Why did Andrew divorce Queen Camilla? When he divorced her, she was not queen. She was Camilla Parker Bowles, his wife of 22 years, mother of his children, central figure in a scandal that had become impossible to contain. He did not divorce a queen. He divorced a woman trapped between a failed marriage and a royal future no one could safely promise. The queenly title came much later, after work, grief, endurance, and the approval of the woman who had worn the crown longer than anyone in British history. That time gap matters. It protects the story from becoming nonsense. Andrew did not look at a future queen and cast her aside. He looked at a marriage that no longer functioned and let it end. History then did what history does. It changed the status of everyone involved and made earlier decisions look more dramatic than they felt at the time. A divorce decree in 1995 became, decades later, part of the origin story of a queen. One suspects the solicitor did not phrase it that way. The Queen's 2022 statement also revealed something about endurance. Camilla had not been rushed into acceptance. She had been tested by time. The public had watched her for nearly 2 decades as Charles's wife. The Queen had watched her privately and publicly. The royal household had seen whether she could handle duty without causing fresh drama. By then, Camilla was in her 70s, with nothing girlish or glittering left to sell. Her case rested on presence, loyalty, and service. These are not exciting virtues, but monarchies rely on them more than they admit. Then came September 2022. Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral, and the reign that had formed the emotional background of modern Britain ended. Charles became king the moment his mother died. Camilla became Queen Consort. The change was instant in law and immense in feeling. A woman once treated as the great threat to Charles's royal life now stood beside him at the beginning of his reign. The country watched an elderly son mourn his mother and become sovereign in the same breath. Charles looked both kingly and stricken, which is the peculiar cruelty of hereditary monarchy. Private grief is given no quiet room. It is dressed in uniform, placed before cameras, and asked to proceed according to timetable. Camilla stood beside him through those days of mourning, proclamation, processions, services, and watchful crowds. Her role was not decorative. It was physical and emotional support under historic pressure. Andrew Parker Bowles was now 82, old enough to have seen the country change beyond anything his younger self could have imagined. He had lived through a world of deference, the collapse of that deference, the exposure of royal marriages, the death of Diana, Camilla's rehabilitation, and the end of Elizabeth's reign. His former wife was Queen Consort. His children were the children of the Queen Consort, though not royal themselves. His family had been folded into the monarchy in a way no one at the Guards' Chapel in 1973 could have predicted, unless they had been drinking something stronger than champagne. Camilla's elevation did not remove the past. In some ways it brought the past back for a final inspection. Newspapers retold the old story. Commentators revisited Diana, Charles, the affair, the tapes, the divorce, the wedding, the Queen's blessing. Andrew's name reappeared, as it always does when people try to explain Camilla. He remained the necessary first husband, the man before the king, the one whose quiet choices made later events less explosive than they might have been. Yet he still did not become noisy. At an age when many people feel entitled to settle scores, Andrew did not publicly unload his grievances. This is remarkable not because older men are usually shy with opinions. Many are not. It is remarkable because his story would sell. A bitter account of marriage to Camilla, rivalry with Charles, humiliation in the 1990s, and the strange experience of seeing one's former wife become queen would attract enormous attention. Andrew had every ingredient needed for a sensational late-life revelation. Instead, the revelation remained in the life he had lived. His answer, visible across decades, was that the divorce had been an act of realism. The marriage had stopped being true. The family could survive better without the fiction. Camilla's future, though uncertain, no longer belonged inside Andrew's household. Andrew's dignity required freedom from a role that had become humiliating. The children needed parents who could remain connected without pretending. The public scandal had destroyed discretion, and discretion had been the roof under which the marriage survived. After Elizabeth's death, Camilla's conduct as queen consort continued the pattern she had built as duchess. She worked, supported Charles, and avoided unnecessary drama. The country was still divided in feeling, but less violently than before. Many who had once opposed her had grown older too. Some had softened, some had not. Some held Diana's memory with undiminished loyalty and still found Camilla's elevation painful. That feeling cannot be brushed aside. The monarchy's new reality rested on old wounds. Charles's reign began with that emotional inheritance. He had waited longer than any Prince of Wales to become king. He came to the throne not as a young symbol of future promise, but as an elderly man with a long record, strong opinions, grown children, grandchildren, and a marriage that had once nearly consumed the institution he now led. Camilla stood beside him not as the fresh face of a new age, but as the proof that life had refused to follow the palace script and then demanded recognition anyway. Andrew, in this final act, became almost a figure from another genre. He was not part of the daily royal machine. He was not issuing statements or shaping policy or walking behind the coffin as central family. But his history stood behind the new queen. He was the man she had married when she was young, the man whose charm had captured and hurt her, the man whose children made her a mother, the man whose marriage to her had provided cover and companionship until it could not, the man who divorced her when the arrangement had collapsed, the man who later stood near enough to show that collapse had not become hatred. That may be the most mature part of the story, and maturity is rarely the part audiences cheer for first. It is easier to applaud romance, pity betrayal, or rage at scandal. It is harder to appreciate the long discipline of not making things worse. Andrew's role after 2005, and especially after Camilla's rise toward queenship, was built on that discipline. He did not rewrite the past to flatter himself. He did not deny the complexity. He did not publicly demand sympathy. He let his actions say what his interviews did not. And those actions said this: a marriage can fail without the family failing completely. A man can be hurt without becoming cruel. A woman can have caused pain and still become useful, loyal, and loved. A royal love story can be both selfish in its beginnings and steadfast in its endurance. A divorce can be not the final insult, but the first honest thing a couple has done in years. By the time Camilla stood beside Charles as queen consort, the old question had become almost too small for the life around it. Why did Andrew divorce her? Because the marriage belonged to a world that could no longer hold the truth of them. Because their lives had moved into separate rooms long before the law acknowledged it. Because the old protections, class, discretion, silence, and mutual tolerance had cracked under public exposure. Because Andrew knew that holding on would not restore love, pride, or privacy. It would only keep everyone trapped in a story that had already escaped. And because, in the end, he seems to have understood something the public took much longer to learn. Letting go is not the opposite of loyalty. Sometimes it is the only form of loyalty left. Loyalty, in Andrew Parker Bowles's world, was never required to be loud. By the time Charles became king and Camilla stood beside him as queen consort, Andrew had spent nearly 3 decades proving that point. He had endured public embarrassment without selling it. He had watched his former wife move from scandal to duchess to queen. He had remained a father, a grandfather, a former officer, a widower, and a familiar figure in circles where everyone remembered everything and almost nobody said the worst of it aloud. At 86, Andrew did not need to reveal his reason with a dramatic confession. His life had been revealing it for years. The divorce had not been a bolt of rage. It had been the conclusion of a long, strange education in what a marriage can survive and what it cannot. It had survived infidelity. It had survived separate emotional lives. It had survived gossip. It had survived the old social rule that anything could be managed if everyone remained well-dressed and faintly cheerful. What it could not survive was exposure so complete that the arrangement itself became cruel. The final proof came not in a divorce court, but at Westminster Abbey. On May 6, 2023, Charles was crowned king, and Camilla was crowned beside him. The Abbey had seen coronations for centuries, but few had carried such a complicated private history into so public a ceremony. There was gold, music, clergy, soldiers, peers, foreign royals, elected leaders, old stone, ancient words, and the peculiar British ability to make even a sacred rite involve seating anxiety. At the centre of it stood a man who had waited his whole life to be king, and the woman many once believed would never be accepted anywhere near the crown. Camilla did not arrive as a young queen, wrapped in national fantasy. She arrived in her 70s with grandchildren, history, critics, loyalists, and a face the public had argued over for half a lifetime. Her coronation was not a fairy tale ending. It was stranger than that. It was a settlement. A woman once blamed as the third person in a royal marriage was anointed and crowned in the same abbey where Britain had crowned queens for generations. History did not ask whether everyone was emotionally ready. It rarely does. It simply opened the door and expected people to walk. Andrew Parker Bowles was there. That fact matters more than any imaginary confession. The former husband attended the coronation of his former wife as queen. There are many civilized divorces in the world, but very few require this level of choreography. Andrew had once married Camilla at the Guards' Chapel in 1973, with royal guests in the pews and the confident hope that the proper match had been made. 50 years later, he watched her crowned beside the man whose presence had helped undo that marriage. A novelist would be told to calm down. Yet Andrew's presence did not look like defeat. It looked like the continuation of a code he had followed for decades. Show up when family requires it. Do not make private history heavier than public duty. Do not embarrass the children. Do not feed the crowd. Above all, do not mistake silence for emptiness. A silent man may be carrying the whole room. Camilla's family was not hidden at the coronation. That was one of the most striking differences between the old royal world and the new one. Her children and grandchildren were part of the day. Her grandson, Freddie Parker Bowles, served as one of her pages of honor, along with her grandsons Gus and Louis Lopes, and her great-nephew, Arthur Elliot. They carried her robes in the abbey, young members of a family that had once been treated as awkward evidence and was now woven into the ceremony. It was a quiet revolution, done in velvet. Those children represented the life Camilla had before the crown. They represented Andrew, too. Whatever else had happened, Camilla's place at that coronation was not only royal, it was maternal, domestic, and blended. The Queen being crowned was not a sealed palace figure. She was Tom and Laura's mother, Andrew's former wife, Charles's partner, and a grandmother whose private family had been pulled into public history by force, then by time, then by ceremony. For Andrew, watching that must have been a complicated triumph and a complicated ache. No decent version of this story requires him to feel only one thing. He may have felt pride in his children and grandchildren. He may have felt satisfaction that Camilla had survived the years when the country treated her like a national mistake. He may have felt old humiliation stir in the walls of the abbey. He may have felt nothing dramatic at all in the moment, because ceremonial days are often too long and stiff for emotional clarity. Sometimes the great feelings arrive later, when the shoes come off. The coronation also showed why Andrew's divorce had been necessary. If he and Camilla had remained legally married, none of this could have happened. But more deeply, if they had remained emotionally trapped in the fiction of marriage, none of them would have had a truthful life. Camilla could not have become Charles's public partner. Andrew could not have rebuilt himself beyond the scandal. Tom and Laura could not have watched their parents find a workable peace. Charles could not have entered his reign with the woman who steadied him. The divorce was painful, but it made reality possible. That is not the same as saying it made everything right. Nothing in this story is that tidy. Diana's absence was present at the coronation, as it had been present at every step of Charles and Camilla's public life. The mother of William and Harry was not erased by robes, jewels, oil, or ancient vows. Her memory still lived in the public imagination and in the lives of her sons. Many people watching in Britain, America, Canada, Australia, and beyond still carried the emotional imprint of Diana's wedding, her loneliness, her confession, her funeral, and the sight of two boys walking behind her coffin. Camilla's crown did not settle that grief. It merely proved that history had moved forward while grief remained seated. This is one reason Andrew's conduct matters so much. He did not try to compete with grief. He did not use Diana's memory as a weapon against Camilla. He did not make himself the forgotten victim in a story already full of wounded people. He stayed in his lane, which is a phrase too small for what it required. His lane was narrow, old, uncomfortable, and lined with photographers. He walked it anyway. After the coronation, Camilla was no longer introduced as Queen Consort in common usage. She was Queen Camilla. The shorter title had the force of finality. For decades, every title around her had been chosen with caution. Mrs. Parker Bowles, Duchess of Cornwall, Queen Consort. Each name had managed public feeling. Queen Camilla did something else. It stated the fact without apology. And still, the woman inside the title remained the same person Andrew had known long before the crown. That may be the private joke at the center of royal life. The public sees names change, ranks rise, carriages roll, and jewels appear. Families see the person who still likes the same dogs, laughs at the same absurdities, and remembers the same ancient arguments. Andrew had known Camilla before the nation hated her, before it tolerated her, before it crowned her. That gave him a perspective no commentator could manufacture. He knew she was never only the villain some imagined. He also knew she was never innocent of the pain around her. He knew she could be warm, funny, stubborn, practical, loyal, and capable of causing hurt. He knew the young woman who had loved a dashing officer, who did not always deserve her patience. He knew the wife who built a household and raised children while learning to live with disappointment. He knew the woman who became Charles's emotional refuge and Diana's anguish. He knew the mother who suffered as her name became a national insult. He knew the queen who had climbed slowly and without glittering ease into a role once thought impossible. That knowledge may be why Andrew never seemed tempted by the cheap version of revenge. Revenge requires simplification. It requires taking a person one has known deeply and reducing them to their worst act. Andrew had many faults, but he did not do that publicly. Perhaps he could not, because to reduce Camilla would also expose the parts of himself that had shaped the marriage. He had not been a blameless husband. His own affairs had helped create the emotional weather in which the later storm formed. He knew the old code because he had used it. He had benefited from the very discretion that later failed them all. That is the harder truth beneath the divorce. Andrew left not as a saint wronged by sin, but as a man who understood sin's social arrangements rather well. He knew how their world had worked. Men strayed and were smiled through. Women endured and were praised for tact. Affairs were tolerated if they did not disturb the furniture. The great crime was not always betrayal. It was embarrassment. This system did not create happiness. It created survivable hypocrisy, which is a rather different achievement. Camilla's relationship with Charles destroyed that system because Charles was not merely another married man in the county. He was the future king. Diana was not merely an unhappy wife. She was the Princess of Wales, adored across the world. Camilla was not merely an old flame. She became the public explanation for a royal marriage collapsing. Andrew was not merely a tolerant husband. He became the man whose marriage proved that the old rules had finally met a scandal too bright to hide. So when people ask why Andrew divorced Camilla, the answer is not that he discovered one betrayal. It is that the whole structure around the betrayal fell down. The private code stopped protecting the family. The marriage stopped protecting Camilla. The marriage stopped protecting Andrew. It stopped protecting the children from whispers. It stopped protecting Charles from truth. It stopped protecting Diana from humiliation. Once that happened, staying married was no longer noble, loyal, or practical. It was simply false. Falsehood had carried them a long way. But by 1995, it could carry them no further. Andrew's later years gave the divorce its proper meaning. Had he vanished into anger, the ending might have looked like pure bitterness. Had he publicly condemned Camilla, the marriage might have been remembered as a simple betrayal. Had he turned the children against her, the divorce might have become another wound passed down the family line. Instead, he behaved as if the marriage had mattered, and because it had mattered, its ending deserved restraint. That is a very particular kind of grace. It is not soft. It is not sentimental. It does not pretend nobody was hurt. It simply refuses to make hurt the only inheritance. In the years after Camilla became queen, Andrew's public image settled into something almost paradoxical. He was the former husband of the queen, a man with one of the strangest footnotes in modern royal history, and yet he remained largely private. He was more interesting because he did not chase interest. He belonged to a generation that often believed publicity was something to be endured, not harvested. This may have saved him. It also made him unusually powerful as a silent witness. The press could revisit the question whenever it liked. Why did he divorce her? Was it Charles? Was it humiliation? Was it his own affairs? Was it social pressure? Was it love gone dry? The answer, when placed across the decades, is all of these and something more basic. The marriage ended because two people who once fit inside the same life no longer did, and because the world around them had stopped allowing the old arrangement to pass quietly as marriage. Andrew and Camilla had begun as a glamorous match in a confident social order. He was the handsome cavalry officer with royal friends and a dangerous charm. She was the lively country girl with good connections, good humor, and a stronger heart than people first noticed. Their wedding gathered the kind of guests who made the union look not only romantic, but correct. Correctness mattered then. It could disguise a surprising amount, but marriage is not saved by correctness. It is saved by daily acts of loyalty, and theirs had too many gaps. Andrew's wandering hurt Camilla. Camilla's bond with Charles hurt Andrew, and far more visibly hurt Diana. Charles's dependence on Camilla hurt his marriage. Diana's pain forced the truth into public view. The press turned suffering into spectacle. The monarchy tried to manage emotion with protocol and learned, rather late, that broken hearts are poor servants. Through it all, Andrew stood in the least glamorous position, the husband who had both wronged and been wronged. That is not an easy role because it denies the comfort of innocence. He could not honestly claim purity. He could not honestly claim indifference. He could not honestly claim that the marriage had been destroyed by one person alone. So he chose the only truthful public posture available to him. He did not explain too much. There are times when silence is cowardice. There are times when it is concealment. In Andrew's case, it was also proportion. What could he have said that would not have made life worse for his children? What could he have revealed that would not have dragged Diana, Charles, Camilla, and himself back through a swamp already crossed? What public confession would have improved the past? A dramatic interview might have satisfied curiosity, but curiosity is not a moral right. Sometimes it is just hunger with better manners. At 86, the revelation is not a sentence, it is a pattern. He divorced Camilla because the marriage had become unlivable as a marriage, though still meaningful as a family bond. He divorced her because love had changed form, and the legal structure had become a lie. He divorced her because Charles was not a passing flirtation, and everyone knew it. He divorced her because public exposure had turned private compromise into humiliation. He divorced her because his own life needed rescuing from a scandal that could no longer be contained. He divorced her because the children needed parents who could stop pretending and start behaving decently in the open. He divorced her because sometimes the most honorable thing left is to admit that honor has already been damaged and then prevent further damage where one can. That is not a clean answer. It is the true kind. The astonishing part is what happened after. Andrew and Camilla remained connected. He attended her wedding blessing to Charles. He was present at her coronation. Their children and grandchildren moved through the new royal reality without being publicly torn in two. Charles and Camilla built a late-life marriage that steadied his reign. Diana's memory remained painful and luminous, refusing to be dismissed. The Queen, who had once watched the scandal with caution, eventually gave Camilla her blessing. The public, after years of anger, softened enough for the coronation to happen without national revolt, which in Britain is sometimes measured by the tone of the cue. None of this makes the early damage disappear. The pain of Diana cannot be edited out because Camilla endured. Andrew's humiliation cannot be erased because he behaved well. Camilla's work as Duchess and Queen cannot erase the suffering tied to her relationship with Charles. Charles's long love cannot erase the failure of his first marriage. The story is not a courtroom where one verdict clears the room. It is a family history, and family histories are famous for leaving several people right and wounded at the same time. That is why the tale still fascinates. It is not only about adultery. Adultery is common enough, sadly, and rarely requires a coronation robe. It is about what happens when private weakness enters a public institution built on symbols of duty. It is about a social class that taught people to endure quietly, then met a media age that rewarded exposure. It is about a princess who made the public feel her pain. It is about a prince who loved the wrong woman at the wrong time and then never stopped. It is about a woman who was punished beyond measure by public contempt and then slowly worked her way into official respect. And it is about a husband who, after all the mess, chose not to become an arsonist standing beside the ruins. Andrew Parker Bowles's restraint did not make him perfect. It made him interesting. He had the flaws of his world and the virtues of it too. The flaws were obvious: entitlement, wandering affections, emotional convenience dressed as sophistication. The virtues were quieter: courage, steadiness, manners under pressure, loyalty to family after romance had failed. He could wound and still protect. He could lose and still attend. He could know the worst and not shout it for applause. Perhaps that is why in old age he appears less like the man left behind and more like the man who understood the cost of staying too long in a false arrangement. Divorce for him was not the abandonment of Camilla. It was the end of a performance neither of them could keep acting without further harm. The affection that remained had to find another shape. It did. Not romantic, not simple, not free of irony, but real enough to carry them through weddings, funerals, family milestones, and finally, a coronation. At the beginning, Andrew and Camilla had looked like the safe match. Charles and Camilla had looked impossible. Diana had looked like the dream. The dream broke. The impossible endured. The safe match ended. That is the sort of outcome that makes families whisper and historians clear their throats. Life has never shown much respect for the seating plan. And so the answer, after decades of gossip, scandal, sympathy, blame, and ceremony, is this: Andrew divorced Camilla because the marriage had already ended in every way that mattered except legally, and because keeping it alive would have served only the lie. He did not stop caring for her. He stopped pretending that caring was the same as being married. He did not deny the children their mother. He gave them a chance to keep both parents. He did not punish Camilla for loving Charles. He removed himself from a story in which his role had become both painful and false. That is a hard kind of wisdom, learned late and paid for publicly. When Camilla stood crowned beside Charles, the world saw the final turn of a royal saga. But Andrew's part of the story had always been quieter and in some ways more adult. He had known her before the crown, loved her before the scandal, lost her before the public understood, divorced her before the monarchy accepted her, and stood near enough at the end to show that the past had not turned to ash. The young cavalry officer and the lively country girl had not become the lifelong couple their wedding promised. They became something odder. Former spouses who survived humiliation, protected their children, and carried a shared history into old age, without making it a weapon. That may not be the romance people expected. It may be more valuable, because in the end, Andrew Parker Bowles did finally reveal why he divorced Queen Camilla. Not with a confession, not with revenge, not with a headline polished for maximum damage. He revealed it by the life he chose afterward. He let go because the marriage was no longer true. He stayed kind because the family still was.